I'm Arthur, and I'm 71 years old. For the past 40 years, I've made my living with a pair of wire strippers in my hand and electrical tape stuck to my fingers. My daughter and her husband have always looked down on me. In their eyes, I was just a tired old electrician who smelled like industrial grease. Last week, they barged into my house and demanded that I move into the windowless attic so they could take over my spacious home. When I flatly refused, my son-in-law completely lost his mind. He grabbed a heavy vintage brass desk lamp and threw it right at my head. The solid metal struck my forehead with brutal force, leaving me bleeding profusely on my own living room floor. My daughter didn't even try to help me up. Instead, she screamed at me, calling me selfish. I didn't shout back. I simply stood up, walked out the front door, got into my Ford truck, and texted my lawyer. Phase 1 complete. Call the police. Before we get into the rest of the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, and if you've ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a harsh lesson about respect. Hit that like button and subscribe. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when the quiet air outside Seattle was shattered. The front door was flung open, sending a booming echo down the hallway. Before I could even get up from my leather armchair, my daughter, Chloe, and her husband, Julian, were already marching into the living room. No hello, no asking how my day was. They just dropped 4 massive designer suitcases onto my hardwood floor. The heavy thud made the house shake. Julian, a 38-year-old crypto and high-end real estate broker, was wearing a custom suit that cost more than my first truck. He looked around my living room with a smirk. Chloe stood there with her arms crossed, her face dripping with entitlement. "Dad, we're moving in," she announced, using the same casual tone she uses to order coffee at Starbucks. Julian's new project requires us to be closer to downtown, and our place in Mercer Island is undergoing a total renovation. We're taking the master bedroom. You need to clear your things out and move up to the attic by tonight. I sat there with my hands on my knees, silently staring at the two of them. I spent 40 years laying high-voltage grids for major commercial data centers and Boeing plants across Washington state, working 60 hours a week just to make sure my daughter never had to struggle. My hands are covered in permanent scars and thick calluses from decades of cutting heavy copper cables and handling high-voltage breaker boxes, but those exact rough hands paid for her expensive private college tuition. Those hands funded a lavish wedding to a man who didn't even bother to shake my hand properly when we first met, only giving me a dismissive nod while casting a disgusted glance at my steel-toed work boots. I looked at Julian, who was eyeing the crown molding on my ceiling with utter contempt. "No," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You are not taking my bedroom, and you're not moving in." Julian snapped his head around, his face turning an angry shade of purple. "What did you say?" he barked, stepping closer. "We aren't asking for your permission, Arthur. We're telling you we need this space. You're just an old man occupying a 4-bedroom house. It's ridiculous." I stood up slowly, planting my feet firmly on the floor. "This is my house, Julian. If you need a place to stay, go rent a 5-star hotel. You will not push me out of my own home." Whatever little composure Julian had left completely vanished. He started shouting, calling me an uneducated blue-collar worker who had no idea how the real world actually operated. His anger boiled over in an instant. He lunged for that heavy brass lamp on the desk, raised it high, and brought it down toward my head. My instincts kicked in, and I raised my arm to block it, but I was a split second too late. The heavy metal slammed into the side of my face and shoulder, and the lampshade shattered against the wall behind me. A sharp, blinding pain shot through my skull. I stumbled back, clutching my forehead. Right away I felt a warm, thick liquid filling my palm and dripping down my chin. It was blood. In the house I built with my own hands, I was bleeding, and the man who did this to me looked at me like I was nothing more than dirt on his expensive shoes. I looked at Chloe, expecting my daughter, the child I raised and poured all my love into, to scream and pull her husband away, to rush to my side and see if I was okay. Instead, she stood there frozen, her eyes wide. It wasn't concern on her face, it was deep irritation. "Look what you made him do, Dad," she yelled viciously. You're being completely selfish. We're your family, and you won't even do us this one simple favor. Julian is under a mountain of stress at work, and you just had to push him over the edge. You're so stubborn and greedy. Her words hurt much worse than the physical blow. She looked at my bleeding face and chose to defend the man who had just assaulted me. I looked down at the shattered pieces of the brass lamp on the floor. That wasn't just a random piece of decor. When I was 24, right after finishing my apprenticeship, I landed my first major industrial grid contract. I spent a whole month pulling heavy cables through damp, dark underground utility tunnels. I came home every night smelling like electrical varnish and sweat, my muscles so sore I could barely sleep. With my first real, substantial paycheck, I bought that lamp for my late wife, Martha. It was our very first luxury. Martha used to polish it every Sunday. She cherished it, telling everyone it was a symbol of our hard work and our lifelong commitment to each other. When she passed away 6 years ago from aggressive breast cancer, that lamp became sacred to me, and now Julian had used it to break my head open simply because I wouldn't hand over my bed. He destroyed a piece of my history, a piece of Martha, without a second thought. He had no idea of its sentimental value, just like he had no idea of my actual financial value. He always assumed I was just a broke retiree living on a meager pension. He had no clue that the calloused old electrician he was insulting actually controlled an 8-figure industrial electrical contracting empire through a blind trust, holding multiple patents for the national power grid. Julian stood there, chest heaving, pointing a finger at me. "You better have your bags packed and be up in that attic by the time we get back from dinner," he snarled, adjusting his designer blazer as if he had just swatted a fly. "If you don't, I swear I will personally throw your junk out onto the front lawn." I didn't reach for a towel. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. And I didn't try to strike back. I just stood up straight, letting the blood drip freely from my forehead onto my collar. I locked my eyes right onto Julian's. The silence in the room became heavy, thick, and suffocating. Julian shifted his weight for a split second as he met my gaze. His arrogant smirk cracked. He expected an old, tired man to back down, to cry, or to throw a useless tantrum. He absolutely did not expect the chilling stillness of a man who had just flipped a definitive switch in his mind. I looked at Chloe, my daughter, the girl Martha begged me to protect on her deathbed. "Never let Chloe fall into the hands of a fraud," Martha had whispered with her final breath. Looking at that fraud now, I realized I had been too soft. I had allowed them to mistake my silence and humility for weakness. I didn't say a single word to them. I just stared until Julian looked away, muttering something about needing a drink before they headed out. I turned around without looking back and walked out the front door. I climbed into my Ford truck, the cool leather seat pressing against my back. I started the engine and caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The cut on my forehead was deep and definitely needed stitches, and my shirt was stained a deep crimson. I drove straight toward the hospital emergency room. With my uninjured hand, I pulled out my phone, opened my messages, and pulled up Victor Vance's contact. Victor isn't some cheap local lawyer you hire for a traffic ticket. He's a high-powered corporate restructuring and asset protection attorney who manages my multi-million-dollar trust and federal tax strategies with the cold precision of a surgeon. Victor had been waiting for my signal for weeks, ever since I first suspected that Julian was drowning in hidden financial trouble. I typed out a text quickly and decisively. Phase 1 complete. Call the police. I hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and drove into the ER parking lot. I knew right then that the trap I had carefully laid out for them had finally snapped shut. Julian thought he had just bullied a helpless old man. He had no idea he had just handed me the legal leverage to dismantle his entire life. I sat in that sterile emergency room waiting area, pressing a blood-soaked piece of gauze tightly against my forehead. A dull, heavy throb pulsed across my face, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I pulled my phone out, opening the security app linked to my house. I had recently upgraded the entire system to high-resolution, commercial-grade cameras. the exact same kind I used to install for corporate vaults. Through the glowing screen, I had a perfect, crystal clear view of my living room. Julian and Chloe hadn't touched a single one of my things. They hadn't started packing my bags for the attic. Instead, Julian was kicked back in my favorite leather recliner, his designer shoes resting on my expensive mahogany coffee table. He held a crystal glass filled with a deep amber liquid. The man had actually broken into my locked private cabinet and opened a bottle of 30-year-old Macallan single malt whiskey I'd been saving for a special occasion. He was laughing, gesturing wildly as he talked to Chloe, likely bragging about how easily he'd handled the old man. I watched that arrogant smirk spread across his face, but it didn't last long. Suddenly, my heavy oak front door was violently breached, the frame splintering inward. The blinding red and blue lights of police cruisers flashed frantically through the front windows, casting chaotic shadows across the living room walls. 4 fully equipped officers from the Seattle Police Department flooded the house, their commands incredibly loud even through my phone's small speaker. Julian leaped from the recliner in total shock, dropping the crystal glass. It shattered into a million pieces, spilling the expensive whiskey across the hardwood floor. He immediately threw his hands up, trying to turn on his Wall Street charm, shouting that he was a respected financial broker and that there had to be some sort of mistake. The officers didn't care about his custom suit, and they certainly didn't care about his excuses. They grabbed him, forced his arms behind his back, and pressed his face hard into the exact same floor he had just demanded I give up. I watched an officer place a heavy knee firmly into Julian's back as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. Julian began to struggle and scream, his face twisted in pure panic, yelling that I was just a senile old man who had lost his mind. Chloe stood in the corner, screaming hysterically and waving her hands, completely powerless against the legal reality pinning her husband down. I calmly locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. A nurse called my name, leading me into a small exam room. A serious-looking young doctor examined the jagged gash on my forehead. He cleaned the wound with a stinging antiseptic that burned like fire, but I didn't even blink. As he prepared the needle and thread to patch my face back together, my thoughts drifted to all the times I had swallowed my pride just to keep the peace in my family. I felt the sharp sting of the needle piercing my skin. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 3. With every pull of the thread, memories of Julian's blatant disrespect flashed in my mind. I remembered Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. I had hosted Julian and his pretentious circle of crypto and venture capital friends. I provided top-tier food, expensive drinks, and genuine hospitality. Julian stood in my dining room holding scotch I had paid for, loudly making jokes at my expense to entertain his guests. "He's a nice guy, but he's just a wire cutter at heart," Julian had sneered, completely unaware that I was standing right outside the kitchen door. "He's pure blue collar, zero financial literacy. If you want to talk investments with him, you have to slow down and use very small words." The group had roared with laughter. I remembered how Julian always made a show of wiping his hands with a napkin after shaking mine, as if the imagined grime from 40 years of honest, hard labor was contagious. He viewed my trade as inferior. He saw blue-collar workers as the absolute bottom of the social ladder. What the arrogant fool didn't realize was that the industrial electrical empire I built from scratch had laid the primary power grids for half the commercial skyscrapers his firm rented space in. The government grid contracts I secured generated more profit in a single month than his shell brokerage handled in an entire year. But I never bragged. Martha and I always believed that wealth should be quiet, and that flashing it was just a sign of insecurity. Julian mistook my silence for ignorance. He mistook my faded flannel shirts for poverty. 4 stitches, 5 stitches. The doctor clipped the medical thread and wiped the area clean. He looked at me with genuine concern, asking if I felt safe going back to that house. I looked at my reflection in the small medical mirror. A thick white bandage covered my forehead. I gave the doctor a cold smile and told him that my house had never been safer. I walked through the hospital's sliding glass doors and out into the cool night air. Before I even reached my truck in the parking lot, The phone in my pocket began vibrating violently. The caller ID flashed Chloe's name. I let it ring 4 times before finally pressing answer and holding the phone to my ear. I didn't even get a chance to say hello. Chloe wasn't calling to ask if my face was all right. She wasn't checking to see if her father needed pain medication or if the doctor had checked for a concussion. She was screaming in a state of pure, unhinged panic and rage. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "They took Julian away like a common criminal. In front of all the neighbors, they shoved him into the back of a police car. He's sitting in a downtown holding cell right now. If he gets a record, the SEC will revoke his license immediately, and his firm will ruin him. Do you have any idea what you've done to his reputation? You call the police department right now and tell them this was all a massive misunderstanding." She was hyperventilating, demanding that I clean up the mess her husband had made. "Tell them you tripped, Dad. Tell them you fell and hit your head on the lamp. Julian is under an immense amount of pressure at work, and you provoked him by refusing to give up that bedroom. You humiliated us over a stupid room. Call the police and drop the charges right now, or I will never speak to you again." She was trying to manipulate me, blaming me for the physical violence used against me, viewing my safety as nothing more than an inconvenience to her social standing. I stood perfectly still by my truck, listening to her rapid, shallow breathing over the speaker. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her chaotic energy. I spoke with an absolute chilling clarity. "I didn't humiliate you, Chloe," I said, my voice low and steady. "Your husband humiliated himself the moment he decided to assault an elderly man with a weapon." I paused, letting the silence stretch long enough to make her incredibly uncomfortable. "And as for your order to drop the charges, you really should have married a real lawyer instead of a fake crypto hustler. If you knew the law, you'd understand how the justice system works in Washington state. Aggravated assault on a senior citizen with a weapon is a felony. The state is pressing charges now, not me. Even if I wanted to drop it, I couldn't. Julian is facing real prison time." I hung up, turned off the phone, got into my truck, and drove home. I returned to the quiet suburban house and carefully wiped away the remaining traces of dried blood from the hardwood floor. The shattered pieces of the brass lamp, the one I bought with my very first major contract paycheck, were swept into a neat pile and tossed straight into the trash. I went upstairs, carefully washed my face around the new stitches, took my prescribed antibiotics, and lay down in the dark. The house was peaceful again, but I knew it wouldn't last. Men like Julian Hayes don't accept defeat gracefully. They lash out. At exactly 2 a.m, a violent, rhythmic pounding echoed from the front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of heavy boots, repeatedly kicking the solid wood. I didn't turn on the bedside lamp. I simply reached for the tablet resting flat on my nightstand and pulled up the front porch camera feed. Julian was standing under the bright, motion-activated floodlights. His expensive custom suit, the one he wore when he attacked me, was wrinkled and stained from hours in a downtown holding cell. His tie was gone. His hair was a complete mess. Standing right behind him was Chloe, clutching her designer bag, looking both exhausted and manic. I knew that bail for felony assault charges was set incredibly high. Knowing their actual spending habits and their obsession with projecting fake wealth, Chloe had likely maxed out every credit card in her name just to secure his temporary release. She had drained her last remaining resources just to get her abusive husband out of a concrete cell. Julian had completely unraveled. He kicked the front door again, the heavy impact vibrating through the walls of my house, and began screaming my name into the cold night air. "Open this door right now, Arthur!" he roared, his voice cracking with pure rage and humiliation. "You think you can do this to me? I am a respected financial broker. I swear I will ruin you. I will take every single thing you own until you're out on the street. You're nothing but a washed-up, uneducated old electrician. Open the door and give us our luggage back." I sat comfortably in my bed, the soft glow of the tablet illuminating my face. I watched him throw a tantrum like a spoiled child in high definition. I didn't go downstairs to confront him. I didn't argue through the intercom. I simply tapped the screen, ensuring that the commercial-grade security system was recording every bit of audio and video flawlessly, saving it directly to a secure cloud server. I watched him lose control like a privileged man who had finally been told, "No." Every violent threat he shouted, every heavy kick he delivered to my reinforced front door was perfectly captured. It was exactly the undeniable proof of his volatility and threatening behavior my lawyer needed to secure a permanent restraining order. I carefully noted the timestamps on the footage and forwarded the digital files straight to Victor Vance. After 20 minutes of useless screaming and pacing, Julian realized that if he kept making a scene, the neighbors might call the police again. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, dragged her toward their luxury rental SUV, and tore off into the dark, leaving deep tire tracks in my driveway. I finally closed my eyes and fell asleep, feeling an overwhelming sense of control. The next morning, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed black coffee filled my kitchen. I sat at the table, in the exact same spot where Julian had thrown the lamp at me just hours before. At exactly 8 o'clock, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. Victor Vance walked up to my front door, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Victor is a man of absolute precision and cold legal strategy. He never wastes time on small talk. He walked straight into my kitchen, accepted a hot cup of coffee, and immediately slid a heavy, packed manila folder across the table to me. "I pulled all of his financial records through private investigative channels last night," Victor said, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Your son-in-law is no venture capital genius, Arthur. He's a walking financial disaster." I opened the folder. The very first document was a bright red foreclosure notice. For months, Julian and Chloe had been bragging about their waterfront estate in Mercer Island, constantly posting photos of their infinity pool on social media to impress their fake friends. But the truth was right there in black and white. They hadn't paid their mortgage in 6 months. The bank was legally seizing the property at the end of the week. I flipped to the next page, and the reality of their situation got even darker. It was an official notice from the SEC and the IRS. For years, Julian had been heavily inflating his income, faking investment returns, and using crypto loopholes to hide money in offshore accounts to avoid federal taxes. His firm had no idea about his illegal side dealings, but the federal government had finally caught up to him. He owed the IRS over $1.5 million in back taxes, severe penalties, and compounded interest. His personal bank accounts had been completely frozen by federal order, his credit score was ruined, and he had absolutely zero liquid cash to his name. Everything clicked together with perfect, brutal logic. Their sudden aggressive demand to move into my house had nothing to do with being closer to downtown for business. It was an act of pure panic desperation. They were about to be thrown out on the street, with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs. Julian's plan was to bully me, force me into the dark attic, and gradually take legal control of my property to save himself from total financial ruin. He looked down on my calloused hands and faded jeans, completely unaware that the man he was trying to scam kept more cash in a single checking account than Julian had earned in his entire life. He thought he was playing chess against a naive, uneducated old blue-collar worker. He didn't realize I owned the board, the pieces, and the table they were sitting at. Martha had warned me years ago. Before my beautiful wife passed away, she held my hand and told me that Chloe was easily blinded by flashy things and empty promises. "Never let Chloe fall into the hands of a fraud," she had whispered. I was looking at undeniable proof that Julian was exactly that, a desperate, failed con man trying to use my life's work as his financial lifeboat. And Chloe was foolish enough to sink with him. Just as Victor and I were mapping out the legal strategy to completely freeze Julian out, a sharp, authoritative knock at the door interrupted us. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't Julian or Chloe returning for their luggage. It was the local chief of police, a serious man I had known personally for over a decade. I opened the door, expecting him to ask for my formal written statement about the violent assault from the night before. Instead, his face was incredibly grave, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. "Arthur," the chief said slowly, removing his hat and shifting his weight. "I need you to step outside with me. Chloe went down to the precinct first thing this morning. She filed a formal, sworn report claiming that you suffer from severe advanced dementia. She told the magistrate that you had a violent paranoid episode yesterday, that you threw yourself into the lamp to cause your own facial injuries, and that you framed her husband because you've lost your mind. She's currently filing an emergency petition with the state court to get immediate legal conservatorship over you, your house, and all of your assets." I thanked the chief for his honesty. I calmly pointed to Victor standing in the kitchen behind me and informed the chief that my high-powered corporate attorney was already drafting a comprehensive response to dismiss my daughter's ridiculous claims. Victor stepped up and handed the chief a stack of medical evaluations I had completed just last month to update my life insurance, proving my cognitive functions were absolutely flawless. The chief nodded, visibly relieved that he wouldn't have to force an old friend from his own home, and turned to leave. Chloe's emergency conservatorship petition was dead on arrival. She had fired her strongest weapon, and it bounced right off my armor. I knew it was only a matter of time before she changed tactics. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera. It was Chloe. She was standing on my front porch, alone, looking like a completely different person from the screaming, entitled woman who had demanded my bedroom. She wore a simple, low-key sweater. She wore absolutely no makeup, leaving her face pale and tired. In her hands, she carried a large glass baking dish covered in tin foil. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Chloe immediately burst into dramatic sobs. She didn't yell. She didn't make demands. She just stood there, letting tears stream down her cheeks, her shoulders trembling slightly. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry," she sobbed, her voice cracking with just the right amount of vulnerability. "I was so wrong. Julian's behavior was completely unacceptable. I was just so scared and overwhelmed by what's happening with his work that I lost my mind. Please, Dad, just let me in. I can't handle us being like this." I silently stepped back, allowing her to cross the threshold into the hallway. She walked straight into the kitchen and set the glass dish on the counter. She pulled back the foil, and the warm, sweet aroma of blackberries, cinnamon, and brown sugar instantly filled the room. I looked down at the dessert. It was a blackberry pie. Not a cheap store-bought pastry, but a homemade pie baked exactly from my late wife, Martha's recipe. It had taken Martha years to perfect that specific recipe, using a secret pinch of nutmeg in the thick, buttery lattice crust that always baked to a perfect golden brown. It was the dessert she made for my every birthday, every Thanksgiving, and every single time I came home exhausted from working on a grueling, months-long industrial grid project. Martha had taught Chloe how to bake it when she was just a little girl, standing on a stepping stool in this exact kitchen. Chloe was weaponizing the memory of her dead mother to manipulate my emotions. She looked up at me, her eyes pooling with fresh tears, playing the part of a heartbroken, remorseful daughter to absolute perfection. "I baked it for you this morning, Dad," Chloe whispered, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "I stayed up all night thinking about Mom. I thought about how disappointed she would be if she saw us tearing each other apart like this. She loved Julian. She loved our family. She always said that no matter how angry we got, we had to find a way to forgive. Mom would never want to see her son-in-law sitting in a cold cell facing felony charges. She would want us to heal." She reached into her purse and pulled out a neatly folded document, sliding it across the kitchen table toward me. "I printed out a formal family settlement agreement," she said, her voice softening into a desperate plea. "Julian is willing to go to anger management counseling. He is deeply ashamed of what he did to your face. This paper just formally states that we've resolved this privately as a family, and that you are officially requesting the district attorney to drop the aggravated assault charges. If you sign this, we can put this nightmare behind us. We can be a family again, just like Mom wanted." I looked at the piece of paper sitting on the table. I didn't reach into my shirt pocket for my reading glasses. Instead, I squinted hard and leaned forward, playing the part of a tired, aging father whose eyesight was failing. I let my hands shake slightly as I smoothed out the document. My eyesight was actually perfect. I could read fine print from 2 feet away. I instantly recognized the legal format. This was absolutely not a family settlement agreement. There wasn't a single word about assault charges or anger management on it. Underneath the misleading cover page, printed in bold at the top, was a durable power of attorney. The exact second the ink from my pen hit that signature line, I would be legally granting Chloe full, unrestricted access to every single bank account in my name, liquidating my investment portfolios, and even selling the very house right out from under my feet. Since she couldn't steal my assets through a fake dementia claim, she was trying to trick me into handing over the keys to the kingdom myself. I looked up at her. She held her breath, her eyes wide with manufactured innocence. I let out a heavy, defeated sigh. "You're right, Chloe," I said, making my voice sound weak and submissive. "Your mother hated it when we fought. All I want is some peace in my house." I reached into my front pocket and pulled out my own pen. It was a sleek black ballpoint pen I had bought from a magic novelty shop years ago to play a prank on one of my electrical foremen. It was filled with highly specialized disappearing ink. The ink flowed in a deep black, permanent-looking stroke when it hit the paper, but the chemical composition caused it to completely evaporate into thin air within 2 hours of exposure to oxygen, leaving absolutely no trace behind. I clicked the pen, pressed the tip to the line, and confidently signed my full legal name at the bottom of the fraudulent power of attorney, Arthur Crawford. The exact second the ink finished the final loop of my name, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted. Chloe didn't say thank you. She didn't hug me, and she didn't offer to cut a slice of the blackberry pie she had baked with her dead mother's recipe. Her fake tears vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, victorious smirk. She snatched the document off the table with lightning speed, nearly ripping the paper, folded it quickly, and shoved it into the deepest pocket of her designer bag. Without saying a single word, she turned on her heel and walked straight out the front door. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen window, watching her practically jog down my driveway toward her luxury SUV. Before she even opened the car door, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. I could see the massive, greedy smile on her face as she pressed the phone to her ear. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that she was calling Julian, bragging about how she had just successfully swindled the old man out of everything he owned. I watched her speed down the street and laughed quietly to myself. I knew exactly what was coming. By the time she proudly slapped that document down on a bank manager's desk, my signature would be completely gone. I didn't even need to be standing in the marble lobby of First National Bank downtown to know exactly how the scene was about to unfold. My lawyer, Victor, had already called the branch manager first thing this morning, giving him a severe warning about a potential fraud attempt on my accounts. Julian and Chloe strutted through the heavy glass doors of the bank like they owned the building. Julian, currently out on bail, had changed into a brand new designer dress shirt, though sweat was soaking through the back of it. His arrogant stride was nothing more than a desperate front to cover up the sinking reality of his financial ruin. Chloe walked straight to the VIP teller counter, completely ignoring the regular line. She demanded an immediate meeting with the branch manager. When they were escorted into a private glass-walled office, Julian didn't even bother to sit down. He aggressively slapped the fraudulent power of attorney flat onto the polished mahogany desk. "We need a cashier's check for $200,000 immediately," Julian demanded, tapping his expensive watch to emphasize his fake importance. "My father-in-law has officially signed over full financial control of his estate to us due to his rapidly deteriorating mental health. We are moving his liquid assets into a secure management fund. Process the withdrawal right now. We don't have all day to sit around and wait." Chloe stood next to him, nodding aggressively, her eyes practically gleaming with greed. She was anticipating stealing my hard-earned savings to rescue her abusive husband from the IRS. They thought they had masterminded the perfect crime. They thought the man sitting behind the desk was just a corporate drone who would blindly obey their wealthy disguise without asking any difficult questions. They were dead wrong. Sitting across from them was the branch manager, a sharply dressed, incredibly sharp, middle-aged man named David. What Chloe and Julian didn't know, because they had never taken the time to ask a single thing about my private life, was the deep history between me and the man currently evaluating their forged document. 15 years ago, long before David wore tailored suits and managed multi-million-dollar portfolios, he was just a struggling 19-year-old kid working the night shift at the local hardware store where I regularly bought my industrial wiring and supplies. I used to walk in covered in insulation lacquer and dirt, and David would always be sitting behind the register, trying to stay awake by reading thick economics textbooks. One night I found him crying on a stack of drywall in the back aisle. His single mother had just lost her job, and David was being forced to drop out of college because they couldn't afford the next semester's tuition. He was ready to give up on his degree to work a minimum wage job full-time. I didn't give him pity. The next morning, I walked into that hardware store and handed David a certified business check from my industrial electrical firm that covered his entire tuition, books, and housing for the next 3 years. When he cried and tried to refuse, promising to pay me back with interest, I simply told him to graduate, get a position of power, and make sure he never let anyone take advantage of hardworking people. David never forgot that moment. He climbed his way up the competitive financial world, eventually becoming the manager of the exact branch where my primary trust funds were securely held. He knew exactly who I was. He knew the staggering size of my actual financial portfolio, and he possessed a fierce, unshakable loyalty to the old electrician who had changed the entire trajectory of his life. David looked at Julian with a calm, unbothered expression. He didn't flinch at Julian's aggressive tone or Chloe's impatient sign. He simply reached out, adjusted his glasses, and pulled the power of attorney toward himself. "I understand you're in a hurry, sir," David said, his voice level and incredibly professional. "However, to authorize a massive withdrawal of $200,000 from Mr. Crawford's primary savings account, I am required by federal regulations to formally verify the signatures and notary seals on this legal document." David was intentionally running down the clock. He smoothed out the paper, he checked the headers, he let a thick silence stretch across the room for a suffocating minute. By the time Chloe had been stuck in heavy Seattle traffic, the 2-hour window on my trick pen had officially closed. The chemical composition of the ink had reacted with the oxygen in the air, completely evaporating from the fibers of the paper without leaving a single trace. David looked down at the bottom of the page, then raised his eyes to stare right at Julian and Chloe with an expression of absolute professional confusion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," David said, turning the document around and sliding it back across the mahogany desk. "But under no circumstances can I process this withdrawal. This document is completely void." Julian slammed his fist onto the desk, his face turning a furious shade of crimson. "What the hell are you talking about? That is a standard durable power of attorney. Move the funds right now, or I will have a complaint filed with your corporate office before the end of the day." David simply pointed a calm finger at the bottom line of the paper. "You cannot execute a power of attorney that has no signature, sir. The signature line is completely blank." Chloe let out a confused gasp and leaned over the desk. She stared directly at the crisp, clean white space where she had watched me sign my name in the kitchen just hours before. There was no ink, no indentation. Absolutely nothing. "That's impossible!" Chloe screamed frantically, flipping the paper over as if the signature had somehow magically slid onto the back. "He signed it. I stood right there and watched him sign it in his kitchen." Julian snatched the paper violently from her hands, his eyes widening in pure panic as he realized the document was completely worthless. "You erased it!" Julian roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at David. "You used some kind of chemical on your desk. You're trying to protect that senile old bastard. Give me the money, or I will have your job today." David's demeanor shifted from polite customer service to absolute, freezing authority in an instant. He didn't raise his voice. He just leaned back in his leather office chair and reached his hand under the desk. "Attempting to execute a fraudulent, unsigned legal document to seize the financial assets of a senior citizen is a serious federal offense, Mr. Hayes," David stated clearly, his eyes locking onto Julian's panicked face. And threatening a bank official while attempting to commit wire fraud is a felony. David pressed his finger firmly against the hidden silent panic button beneath his desk. Instantly, the heavy magnetic security locks on the bank's main glass doors engaged with a loud, echoing click. The digital displays above the teller stations flashed a bright, warning red. Two armed security guards immediately stepped away from the perimeter walls and stood directly outside the glass door of David's office, completely cutting off any chance of an escape. Julian and Chloe spun around, realizing they were completely trapped inside a federally regulated building with a forged document in their hands. Julian was already out on bail for felony assault, and now he had been caught red-handed attempting to rob a bank. The trap had closed flawlessly. Despite being detained at the bank, Julian and Chloe managed to secure a brief release by utilizing what was left of their high-priced defense attorneys, exploitation of legal loopholes, allowing them temporary freedom while federal indictments were formally prepared. However, Julian was now a completely cornered animal. The frozen assets and looming IRS foreclosure meant his borrowed time was evaporating by the hour. Since his attempt to forge my signature had failed miserably, he needed a strictly legal avenue to strip me of my autonomy. He needed the state to declare me mentally incompetent. Just 2 days after the bank incident, a silver sedan pulled into my driveway. A tall, overly groomed man stepped out, wearing a sharp gray suit that radiated misplaced arrogance. I recognized him instantly from the dossier Victor had gathered on Julian's associates. This was Eris, a notorious probate investigator and social worker who specialized in fixing conservatorship cases for a price. 他大步走到我的门廊，带着攻击性的权威按响了门铃。当我打开门时，他没有礼貌的自我介绍，他直接从我身边挤了过去，挥舞着一个并不印有虚假时正印章的价值板。Mr. Crawford, I am here to conduct a state-mandated cognitive wellness examination, Eris declared, his tone dripping with fake bureaucratic authority. Serious concerns have been raised by your family regarding your ability to care for yourself. I am legally required to assess your mental status today. If you refuse, I will call the authorities to have you removed from this property on an involuntary psychiatric hold. I looked over his shoulder and out past the open door. I saw Julian's luxury SUV sitting at the end of the street, idling in the shadows. Julian was waiting for the golden ticket. I didn't argue, and I didn't try to block the door. I simply stepped aside, giving a weak, trembling nod, and led the corrupt assessor into my kitchen. Eris sat down at my table, lay out his forms with a dramatic precision that showed he liked the sound of his own voice. He looked around my modest house, his eyes lingering on my worn-out work boots by the door and the faded flannel jacket draped over a chair. I could see the absolute disdain radiating from his posture. He looked at me the exact same way Julian did. All he saw was a dirty, uneducated laborer who had outlived his usefulness. People like Eris possess expensive degrees framed on walls, yet lack a single ounce of real wisdom or moral substance. Over 40 years of running a massive industrial electrical company, I've met hundreds of men exactly like him. They're the same high and mighty architects and developers who would lecture my guys in theoretical terms, only to call me in a blind panic when their multi-million-dollar luxury high-rises caught fire because they cut corners and overloaded the main power grid. I knew exactly how to dismantle a man who based his entire self-worth on a piece of paper. Mr. Crawford, you've spent your whole life working with your hands, Eris said, leaning forward and speaking with a slow, insulting cadence, as if talking to a toddler. Manual labor takes a heavy toll on the brain. Continuous exposure to toxic chemicals, extreme physical exhaustion, a distinct lack of higher intellectual stimulation. It's completely normal for men of your obvious blue-collar background to experience rapid cognitive decline later in life. We're just here to make sure you don't hurt yourself or squander whatever little savings you have left. He was laying the groundwork for his fraudulent medical report, building the narrative that my decades of honest hard work had somehow rotted my mind. He had no idea that the blue-collar laborer sitting across from him possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of complex federal tax law, corporate trust structures, and commercial contract law. He thought he was walking into an easy payday, an effortless scam arranged by his wealthy client, Julian. He had no clue he had just stepped onto a financial and legal landmine. I let my shoulders slump, projecting the image of a defeated, frail old man, and folded my hands neatly in my lap. What Eris couldn't see, taped securely just beneath the edge of the kitchen table with industrial strength adhesive, was a high-fidelity digital audio recorder. I had installed it the night before, anticipating that Julian would send someone straight to my house. With a tiny silent flick of my thumb, I hit the record button. A microscopic hidden red light indicated that the device was actively capturing every sound in the room. "Let's start with some basic questions," Eris said, clicking his pen. "Can you tell me what year it is, Mr. Crawford?" I stared blankly at the wall for a long moment, furrowing my brow. "It's 1998, I said, intentionally lowering my voice to a whisper, naming the year my late wife Martha and I bought this house. Eris let out a quick, quiet scoff and scribbled frantically on his clipboard. "And who is the current president of the United States?" He followed up. I gave him the name of a politician who had left office over a decade ago. My performance was flawless. When he asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, I stopped at 85, rubbing my temples and muttering that my head hurt too much to think about numbers. The scammer's smugness was palpable. He leaned back in his chair, completely dropping his professional disguise. "Julian was absolutely right." Eris chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You are completely gone, old man. You don't even know what decade you're living in. This is going to be the easiest 15 grand I've ever made in my career." I kept my eyes fixed on the table, maintaining my vacant expression while my heart pounded with silent victory. The greedy fool had just admitted on a hidden microphone, loud and clear, that he was taking a $15,000 cash bribe from my son-in-law to falsify a medical document. Eris aggressively checked the final box on his evaluation sheet and snapped his clipboard shut with a loud pop. "Well, Mr. Crawford, that concludes our assessment," he announced, standing up and smoothing his expensive tie. "I will be submitting this report to the State Department of Health and the probate court immediately. For your own safety, you'll be transferred to a specialized care facility very soon." He turned his back to me and walked straight out the front door, pulling out his phone to call Julian with the good news. The exact second the heavy oak door clicked shut, the blank, confused look vanished from my face. I sat up perfectly straight, my mind razor sharp. I reached under the table, retrieved the digital recorder, and stopped the tape. I plugged the device into my laptop, attached the crystal clear audio file to an encrypted email, and sent it directly to Victor Vance. My message was short and absolute. Add medical fraud and witness bribery to Julian's federal indictment. This investigator just handed us the nail for his coffin. Less than an hour after I forwarded the corrupt investigator's audio file to my attorney, my phone rang. It was Victor. His voice usually carried a calm, calculated legal detachment, but this time there was a rare hint of genuine urgency. "The recording of that guy admitting to the bribe is perfect," Victor said, "but that's no longer our most immediate problem." While Eris had been sitting in my kitchen trying to fabricate a dementia diagnosis, Victor had deployed a highly specialized forensic accountant to dig deep into the financial infrastructure of Julian's business dealings. What they uncovered went far beyond simple missed mortgages or inflated credit card debt. Julian was in a state of absolute frantic panic. He knew the IRS was slowly tightening the noose around his domestic accounts, so he was taking extreme illegal measures to salvage his stolen wealth. He was currently attempting to move his remaining liquid assets out of the United States. The forensic accountant had intercepted a series of highly complex, layered electronic wire transfers, routing hundreds of thousands of dollars to newly formed shell companies in the Cayman Islands. He was trying to hide the cash from federal seizure, hoping to establish a secret backup fund to fall back on when his domestic life inevitably collapsed. But Julian was a coward. He knew the massive risks involved in executing these illegal international transfers. So he didn't put his own name on those offshore accounts. He had forged Chloe's digital signature and explicitly listed her as the primary co-owner of the shell corporations. He was using my own daughter as a human shield. If the federal government tracked down those missing funds, Chloe would be held equally liable for international tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand-scale money laundering. She would face decades in a federal prison right alongside him. To protect his stolen cash, he was entirely prepared to sacrifice his own wife, the woman he had sworn to protect. A deep, heavy silence filled my quiet kitchen as I stared at the devastating financial documents Victor had securely transmitted to my tablet. My mind drifted back 6 years to a sterile, quiet hospital room, bathed in the soft, fading light of a late autumn afternoon. My beautiful wife, Martha, lay in that medical bed, her body frail from a brutal battle with illness, but her mind as sharp and protective as the day I first met her. She held my calloused, scarred hands tightly in her weak grip. Martha always possessed an uncanny ability to see through people. While Chloe had been completely blinded by Julian's custom suits, luxury rental cars, and smooth Wall Street vocabulary, Martha saw the emptiness and greed hidden behind his charming smile. She knew Julian wasn't a provider. She knew he was a parasite. On her final day, her breath was shallow, but her grip was remarkably firm as she pulled me close. "Never let Chloe fall into the hands of a fraud," she whispered to me, her voice raspy but absolute in its command. "She's blinded by the flash of fake gold, Arthur. Protect her, even if you have to break her heart to do it. Save our daughter from a man who only loves himself, no matter what it takes." I had made a solemn, unbreakable vow to my dying wife that afternoon. Staring at the irrefutable evidence of Julian deliberately tying Chloe to a massive federal crime, I knew exactly what keeping that promise required. Protecting my daughter didn't mean bailing her out with my hidden wealth or shielding her from the harsh consequences of her foolish marriage. It meant completely destroying the parasite she was attached to. It meant dismantling Julian's entire empire of deceit, brick by brick, so he could never exploit her or anyone else, ever again. I had to execute Martha's final wish with cold, surgical precision. I had to let the fire burn away the dead wood so a real foundation could be built. I didn't wait for morning. I didn't leave this to my legal team to negotiate slowly in civil court. I walked straight into my home office, booted up my highly encrypted desktop computer, and accessed the official online portal for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The federal government has a highly structured whistleblower program designed specifically to reward and protect individuals who provide significant, actionable evidence of major tax fraud and financial crimes. I had zero interest in a financial reward. I was only interested in the absolute, crushing power of a federal hammer coming down hard on Julian's life. Methodically, I created a comprehensive digital file. I uploaded every single piece of evidence Victor's forensic accountant had uncovered. I attached the specific routing numbers for the Cayman Islands shell companies. I included the time-stamped logs of the illegal wire transfers. I compiled the fraudulent tax returns Julian had filed over the last 4 years, alongside the forged corporate documents illegally tying my daughter to his international financial crimes. I made sure to explicitly highlight the digital footprint that proved Chloe had zero knowledge of the offshore accounts, isolating Julian as the sole mastermind of the fraud to ensure my daughter wouldn't be taken away in handcuffs by federal agents. I gave the submission packet one final review, making sure every single document was legible, categorized, and undeniably devastating. With the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, I hovered the mouse over the screen. Using a calloused finger, I firmly pressed the submit button. The encrypted packet vanished into the federal database. There was no turning back. Julian's financial death warrant had been officially signed, sealed, and delivered to the most ruthless collection agency on the planet. The very next morning, the sleek, high-pressure environment inside Julian's prestigious downtown venture capital firm was suddenly and violently shattered. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass elevator doors slid open on the 40th floor. A team of 6 grim-faced agents stepped out, wearing dark windbreakers with the words IRS Criminal Investigation printed in bold yellow text across their backs. 他们没有在接待处停留以寻求许可，他们完全绕过了安全门，手里拿着控制箱和以后他联邦搜查令。他们径直走过安静的玻璃走廊，越过数十名锃亮、窃窃私语的高官，一脚踢开了朱利安角落办公室那扇沉重的橡木门。Julian was sitting in his expensive leather chair, sipping a latte and reviewing a spreadsheet. The smug, arrogant sneer was instantly wiped from his face as armed federal agents flooded his private workspace. They slammed a comprehensive zero-tolerance asset freeze and seizure order onto his pristine glass desk, ordering him to step away from his computer immediately and keep his hands where they could see them. He was a drowning man, and a drowning man will claw at anything to stay afloat. Less than 48 hours after federal agents stormed his office and froze his entire existence, my phone vibrated with a message. It was a video file sent directly from Julian. I opened it and found a heavily altered, maliciously spliced clip of my living room security footage from the day he threw the lamp. However, the footage had been severely edited. The frames showing Julian throwing the lamp were completely cut out. Instead, the video abruptly jumped and looped, showing a brief moment where I raised my arm in self-defense, immediately followed by a clip of Chloe tripping over one of her own designer suitcases. Without the original context, the edited video looked exactly like I had violently shoved my own daughter onto the hardwood floor during an unprovoked rage. A second later, Julian called me. I answered, and his voice boomed through the speaker, manic, hysterical, and dripping with cornered desperation. "You listen to me very carefully, old man," Julian hissed, his breathing rapid. "In exactly 2 hours, I'm sending this video to the local news stations, to your neighbors, and to the police department. I will have you locked up for domestic violence. Your entire reputation in this community will be completely ruined. You will rot in a jail cell." I listened to his ragged breathing, keeping my own absolute and steady. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked, intentionally making my voice sound thin and afraid. "I want the mountain lodge in Snoqualmie," he demanded instantly. "My lawyer has already drafted a quitclaim deed. You are transferring that property and the land directly to Chloe and me right now. No trusts, no strings attached, just a straight-up transfer deed. You meet me at my lawyer's office in 30 minutes and sign it over, or I hit send and your life is over." He texted me an address to a flashy, cheap law firm located in a commercial strip mall. The exact kind of place a desperate man goes when real, high-caliber corporate firms refuse to return his calls. I drove my truck across the city, mentally preparing for the most important performance of my life. When I walked into that cramped, dimly lit conference room, Julian was already sitting at the table. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same wrinkled suit from the day of his arrest. The dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept since the federal agents raided his firm. Yet despite the catastrophic reality staring him down, he still wore that exact same sickeningly arrogant sneer. He genuinely believed he had just checked me. "You finally realize who you're dealing with," Julian scoffed as I sat across from him. His shady defense lawyer slid a thick stack of legal documents across the cheap laminate table. Julian leaned forward, propping his elbows on the desk, eager to twist the knife. He needed to humiliate me to feel powerful again. 升职40年的时间在费了和高雅店里爬行，亚瑟, Julian said, his voice dripping with absolute disdain. "You worked a job a high school dropout could do, ruined your knees and scarred your hands. You saved pennies for decades to pay off that pathetic vacation home. And now, because you're a weak, uneducated laborer who doesn't understand how the real world works, you're handing your biggest asset over to me in 5 minutes." I sat perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me like water off a stone. I didn't defend my trade. I didn't mention the multi-million-dollar commercial supply contracts I'd executed or the backbones my company laid for massive data centers. I let his massive, fragile ego inflate to the breaking point. People like me always win. Julian continued with a dry, bitter laugh. We use our brains. We don't use our hands. You're just a dirty old electrician, and I'm the one walking away with a $2 million property. Sign the paper, Arthur. Sign it now, or I swear to God I will release that video and watch the cops drag you out of your house in handcuffs. I knew the video was a pathetic bluff. Victor already had the original unedited security footage with timestamps securely saved in a cloud server. I could easily dismantle Julian's threat with a single phone call to the district attorney, but dismantling his threat meant keeping the lodge, and right now giving Julian exactly what he wanted was the deadliest weapon in my hands. I needed him to take ownership of that specific property, so I played the role of a broken, terrified father. I slumped my shoulders forward, letting my posture collapse. I looked away, staring at the table as if I had completely given up. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy black pen provided by the lawyer. I let my hand shake violently. I brought the pen to the paper, hovering over the signature line, and looked up at Julian with wide, fearful eyes. If I sign this, I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly, you have to promise to delete that video. You can't show it to anyone. You have to promise to leave me alone. Julian snatched the pen from my hand and slammed it back into my palm, pointing aggressively at the dotted line. I don't promise you a damn thing until you sign, he barked. Sign the deed, old man. Give me the house. With a manufactured, heavy sigh of complete defeat, I pressed the pen to the paper. I didn't use disappearing ink this time. I used permanent, legally binding ink. I signed my full name, authorizing the absolute, direct transfer of that $2 million suburban vacation property and the land into the names of Julian and Chloe. The lawyer quickly grabbed the document, stamped it with a notary seal, and declared the transfer legally binding. A massive, victorious smile erupted across Julian's face. He was practically shaking with excitement. In his desperate, panicked mind, he had just secured a massive, unmortgaged asset that he could leverage or sell to pay off the IRS and save himself from a federal prison sentence. He had absolutely no idea he had just swallowed a lethal dose of financial poison. I slowly stood up, playing the role of a broken man until the very last second, and walked out of the conference room. Julian followed me out into the bright parking lot. As I reached the door of my truck, Julian called out to me. I turned around to see him laughing out loud, completely drunk on his fake victory. What a pathetic, miserable old bastard, Julian yelled, not caring who in the parking lot heard him. Go rot in a cheap apartment, you loser. I didn't get angry. I didn't shout back. I just looked at him standing there in his wrinkled suit, and I let a tiny, cold, incredibly mysterious smile spread across my face. I turned around, got into my truck, and drove away, leaving him to celebrate a victory that was going to completely destroy him. I drove my truck back to the quiet mountain lodge I had owned for decades. I knew my time in that house was officially over, but I needed to gather a few personal belongings. However, Julian hadn't wasted a single second. As my truck pulled into the driveway, another vehicle was already parked on the front lawn. It was a commercial locksmith's van. I walked up the concrete path and saw a man in coveralls using a power drill to break through the heavy brass deadbolt on my front door. Chloe was standing on the porch, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, watching me approach with a cold, unapologetic glare. Julian sauntered out of the living room, waving the newly notarized quitclaim. Deed in the air like a golden ticket. A triumphant manic energy radiated from his pores. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack a single suitcase and get the hell off my property, Julian announced, his voice carrying down the street for any nosy neighbors to hear. The locksmith is putting the new deadbolts on right now. You don't own this place anymore, Arthur. It belongs to us. I looked at Chloe, giving her one last chance to show a shred of empathy or remorse for throwing her aging father out onto the street. She didn't even blink. You brought this on yourself, Dad, she said, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. If you had just given up the master bedroom when we asked nicely, we wouldn't have had to play hardball. Go get your things. We have contractors coming to measure the space tomorrow. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for more time or plead for a place to sleep. I simply walked past them, my heavy work boots thudding against the hardwood floor for the last time. I went into my bedroom and pulled a small vintage leather suitcase from the top of the closet. I didn't pack clothes or toiletries. I only packed what actually mattered. I packed the framed photos of Martha, the small wooden jewelry box she kept on her nightstand, and the original set of heavy-duty, insulated pliers I used to finish my very first commercial contract. Everything else in this house was just meaningless material. I snapped the suitcase shut and walked down the stairs. Julian was waiting at the bottom, tapping his foot impatiently. He aggressively ripped the suitcase from my hand and threw it out the open front door, letting it land on the concrete walkway before pointing out toward the street. "Go enjoy the homeless shelter, old man," Julian laughed, his voice dripping with pure malice. The locksmith slammed the heavy new door right in my face, and I heard the distinct, heavy click of the new locks sliding into place. As I stood alone on the walkway, staring at the closed front door, I thought about what Julian had actually just taken ownership of. He had been completely blinded by his own greed and the panic of desperately needing assets to clear his debt with the IRS. He saw a $2 million house and seized it. What he failed to do was run a basic title search. If he had hired a competent corporate attorney instead of a cheap street lawyer next to a strip club, he would have discovered a massive secret buried deep within the property's zoning history. 3 years ago, after Martha passed away, my lawyer, Victor Vance, and I underwent a massive financial restructuring of my entire empire. We moved my commercial wealth into a series of highly insulated, ironclad blind trusts. But this specific residence in Snoqualmie was handled entirely differently. Because of the massive scale of my industrial electrical operations across Washington state, I required a legally registered secondary transit station for decommissioning older transformers and specialized equipment. With the assistance of Victor and federal regulatory agencies, I officially rezoned this specific residential address, along with its massive reinforced concrete detached barn, as a registered commercial hazardous materials staging site. I legally tied the property to my Industrial Waste Management Corporation. The house wasn't just a house. It was a highly regulated corporate liability entity. Anyone who accepted a direct, unprotected transfer of title to this specific property, outside the protective umbrella of my corporate trusts, wasn't just acquiring real estate equity. They were legally assuming full, unfiltered personal liability for the environmental status of the commercial site. By forcing me to sign that direct quitclaim deed into his personal name, Julian had completely bypassed my corporate liability firewalls. He had eagerly swallowed a lethal financial poison pill, totally unaware that the medicine he thought would cure his IRS problems was actually going to completely ruin him. I heard the dull pop of a champagne cork coming from inside the living room. Julian and Chloe were celebrating. They thought I was going to walk to a bus stop or call a cheap taxi to take me to a rundown motel. They thought I was broken. A moment later, a sleek, custom black luxury SUV with deep tinted windows and flawless chrome detailing slid silently to the curb right in front of the house. The driver, a professional private chauffeur hired directly by Victor Vance, stepped out wearing a crisp black suit and white gloves. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over to my vintage suitcase, picked it up with immense respect, and placed it gently into the carpeted trunk. Then he held the rear passenger door open for me. I stepped into the plush, pristine leather interior of the luxury vehicle. The climate control was set perfectly. A bottle of chilled, premium sparkling water was waiting for me in the console. I leaned back into the seat, looking out through the tinted glass at the house I had lived in for decades. I didn't feel a single shred of sadness. I felt no regret. I only felt a cold, deep satisfaction for the absolute justice that was about to unfold. The chauffeur clicked the heavy door shut, sealing out the noise of the suburban street, and the SUV glided smoothly away. We weren't heading to a shelter. We were driving to my actual permanent residence, a breathtaking multi-million-dollar off-grid fortress estate converted from a former Cold War communications bunker in eastern Washington. Chloe and Julian had absolutely no idea it even existed. I left them behind to dance in their empty, toxic victory. Inside the house, Julian was fully enjoying his fake triumph. He poured himself another glass of champagne and decided to explore his newly conquered territory. He was eager to find the heavy old safe he knew I kept down in the basement of the detached barn. He desperately wanted to see if the stupid old electrician had left behind any hidden cash or valuable family heirlooms. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from a kitchen drawer, unlocked the heavy iron door leading beneath the barn, and walked down the creaking wooden stairs into the damp, echoing space. He swept the bright beam across the cold concrete floor, searching for a metal safe. Instead, the harsh light caught a massive, towering stack of objects in the far corner. Julian froze in his tracks. Lined up neatly against the reinforced concrete wall were 12 heavy industrial-grade sealed steel drums and several disassembled components of massive industrial transformers. Each drum was tightly sealed with heavy metal clamps. Affixed to the exact center of every single container was a massive bright red commercial warning label that read, "Highly regulated toxic, PCB waste." Julian stared at the glowing red labels, the arrogant smirk melting completely off his face as a sudden icy wave of dread gripped his stomach. He stood paralyzed in the damp basement, the beam of his heavy flashlight shaking violently with the tremors in his body. He had no idea what specific chemicals were inside those sealed industrial drums, but his corporate survival instincts screamed that he was looking at a massive, catastrophic liability. Before he could even step closer to examine the federal identification codes stamped into the metal, a loud, amplified voice echoed from the street outside, cutting right through the floorboards above his head. It wasn't the local police this time. It was a federal megaphone. Julian dropped the flashlight and raced up the wooden stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs as he threw open the front door with Chloe rushing right behind him. The quiet mountain street had been completely overtaken. 3 white commercial vans and 2 black government SUVs were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn and driveway. Men and women wearing bright yellow hazmat suits, with the words EPA and Department of Energy printed in bold black text across their backs, were already laying down thick yellow caution tape, efficiently locking down the entire perimeter of the property. The authorities arrived fully equipped and completely business-minded. A serious-looking woman with a federal badge hanging around her neck and a thick metal clipboard in her hand walked straight up the concrete path. "Are you Julian Hayes?" she asked sharply, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or Wall Street charm. Julian swallowed hard, giving a weak nod while desperately trying to straighten his wrinkled, sweat-stained suit jacket. The woman gestured to 2 uniformed officials who immediately stepped onto the porch. "We received an automated regulatory notification from the county clerk that the commercial title for this registered hazardous material staging site was transferred directly into your personal name yesterday afternoon," the federal agent stated firmly. "Step off the porch immediately. This location is subject to a mandatory commercial compliance inspection for the handling of regulated industrial fluids." Chloe looked at Julian in absolute terror, clutching his arm. Julian tried to flash his best consultant smile, raising his hands defensively as if he were trying to negotiate a failing boardroom deal. "Ma'am, there must be a massive misunderstanding here," he stammered, sweating profusely in the morning sun. "This is just a standard residential house. We just took over ownership from my father-in-law. He's a retired electrician. There's no commercial activity here." The agent didn't smile back. She simply pointed a stiff finger toward the street, ordering them to stand behind the yellow perimeter line. As Julian and Chloe stood shivering behind the bright plastic tape, they watched a professional inspection team march straight into the house and head directly for the basement door beneath the barn. What Julian completely failed to comprehend was the actual staggering scale of my life's work. When you run an 8-figure industrial electrical company servicing 50-story corporate skyscrapers, massive sports arenas, and the power grids of major hospitals, you aren't handling house wires sold at a local hardware store. You handle massive transformers containing heavy containment fluids like PCBs. These specific materials require specialized handling, strict transportation manifests, and tightly monitored storage facilities. Decades ago, as my company expanded across Washington state, I needed a centralized, highly secure location to temporarily house these industrial materials before legally routing them to specialized commercial processing plants. With Victor's assistance and utilizing a perfectly legal municipal zoning loophole, I successfully established this suburban property's reinforced basement as a registered commercial hazardous materials staging site. It was fully permitted, strictly regulated, and tied directly to my corporate entities. As long as the property remained under the protective umbrella of my corporate trust, the massive environmental fees, liability insurance, and handling costs were seamlessly absorbed by my company's multi-million-dollar operating budget. But Julian knew none of this. He was too busy looking down on my calloused hands and faded work clothes to ever bother looking at my corporate filings. When he maliciously forced me to sign that quitclaim deed, stripping the property away from my insulated corporate trust and moving it directly into his personal name, he triggered an automatic federal audit. The system instantly flagged the illegal transfer of a registered site to an unlicensed, unbonded private citizen. Julian hadn't just stolen a mountain lodge. He had legally adopted an active, highly regulated commercial liability facility without holding any of the permits or commercial insurance policies required to maintain it. He had walked right into a devastating financial bear trap that I had left wide open for him. After 20 suffocating minutes, the lead agent walked out of the house, her expression significantly darker than before. She marched straight to the yellow tape, where Julian and Chloe were waiting nervously, surrounded by a growing crowd of curious neighbors. She pulled a thick stack of heavily stamped official documents from her clipboard and slapped them directly against Julian's chest. "You have 12 drums of Class 4 industrial fluid improperly stored on this property as a private citizen," the agent announced loudly, ensuring every single neighbor could hear each word. "Because you took direct personal ownership of this regulated site without securing the mandatory transfer permits or commercial insurance, you are now in severe violation of environmental protection laws." Julian frantically flipped through the dense legal documents, his eyes darting across the pages in absolute panic. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. "What does that mean?" Chloe shrieked, looking at the papers shaking violently in her husband's hands. "It means your husband is now personally liable for the immediate commercial extraction, specialized transportation, and official disposal of the hazardous materials currently sitting in your basement," the agent replied coldly. Julian's knees practically buckled when he saw the final page of the citation. Printed in bold at the bottom, directly above his newly registered status as the sole owner, was the total amount for the environmental fines and commercial disposal fees. It wasn't a minor administrative ticket. It was a legally binding invoice for $1,500,000, due in full within 30 days. "If you fail to remit the payment," the agent continued relentlessly, "the government will place a mandatory, inescapable lien against this property, and you will face immediate criminal prosecution for the unlawful management of regulated waste." Julian could barely breathe. He was already out on bail for a felony assault charge. He already owed the IRS $1.5 million with frozen bank accounts. And now, entirely because of his own greed and supreme arrogance, he owed another $1.5 million to the Environmental Protection Authorities. He was completely, irreversibly ruined. Julian ripped his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling violently as he dialed my number. I was sitting comfortably on the sun-drenched cedar deck of my multi-million-dollar fortress estate, holding a steaming mug of premium dark roast coffee. The expansive private lake before me was perfectly still, looking like a flawless sheet of glass reflecting the bright morning sky. The air was crisp, clean, and completely devoid of city noise. I tapped the screen to answer the call, switched it to speaker, and set the device down on the patio table. "Arthur, you set me up!" Julian screamed into the phone, his voice completely unraveling, cracking with absolute desperation. "You gave me a toxic waste dump. You owe the government $1.5 million. I took a slow, incredibly satisfying sip of my coffee, listening to the soothing sound of the water gently lapping against my private wooden dock. I don't owe anyone a dime, Julian, I replied, my voice steady, calm, and absolutely unyielding. You're a highly educated Wall Street financial expert. You really should have read the fine print before you stole an old electrician's house. Have a wonderful morning. An animalistic scream tore from deep inside Julian's throat over the line. He wasn't just angry. He was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. You can't do this to me, he roared, his screeching voice echoing through the speaker, breaking the quiet morning breeze over my private lake. I will sue you for everything you have. I'll take this all the way to the state's Supreme Court. This is textbook fraud, Arthur. You intentionally trapped me with a toxic property. I listened to his frantic, hyperventilating gasps, picturing him standing behind that yellow tape, surrounded by federal agents. Undo the deed, Julian demanded, his tone shifting instantly from blind rage to a pathetic, trembling desperation. Call your shady lawyer right now and rip up that contract. We will transfer the property back to your name today. I'll sign whatever you want me to sign. I don't want this house. I don't want this debt. You have to take it back. He was practically hyperventilating, the crushing weight of a $1.5 million federal invoice completely shattering what was left of his sanity. Through the receiver, I could clearly hear the heavy thud of the inspection team's boots moving across the porch. I could hear Chloe sobbing uncontrollably in the background, begging a federal official to explain what this would do to her credit score. Julian completely ignored his weeping wife, channeling all his manic energy into trying to bully me one last time. Listen to me, Arthur, Julian pleaded, his voice breaking. I will delete the security video. I will go down to the precinct right now and formally withdraw my statement. I'll tell them I lied about the assault. I'll drop every single charge against you. I'll even let you move back into the master bedroom. Just reverse the papers immediately. If you don't take this transfer back, I swear to God, I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison for environmental terrorism. Reverse it now. I leaned back into my comfortable cedar chair, the warm morning light reflecting off the water, and let the pure, poetic irony of the moment wash over me. For years, Julian had made it his personal mission to diminish my life's work. At family dinners, holiday gatherings, and casual weekend visits, he never missed an opportunity to make a cruel joke at the expense of the industrial electrical trade. To him, I was just an uneducated laborer who worked for simple wages, turning screws and running lines. He viewed himself as a modern master of the universe simply because he wore Italian suits and moved imaginary numbers across a computer screen in a sterile, air-conditioned high-rise. He was entirely incapable of understanding that the physical infrastructure of this country was built, maintained, and operated by calloused hands and men in heavy steel-toed boots. Industrial electricity wasn't just wires and wrenches. It was navigating incredibly complex municipal grids, managing highly corrosive materials, and handling massive logistics networks. Now his arrogance had led him straight to his own ruin. What final move do you think Julian has left as his entire world completely collapses around him? Julian despised the black soot under my fingernails, but he had absolutely no idea that grime was a highly regulated industrial byproduct that generated tens of millions of dollars for my company. Back then, whenever I came home from a massive on-site inspection, Julian would pinch his nose and steer clear of me, genuinely disgusted by the smell of industrial labor on my skin. But now the absolute peak of cosmic irony had finally arrived. This arrogant financial elite, the man who refused to shake my hand unless he could immediately use a disinfectant wipe, was completely buried under the exact industrial waste he found so repulsive. He thought he was stealing a pristine, valuable suburban asset that he could cash out to save himself from the IRS. Instead, his aggressive, unyielding greed had legally tied him to the absolute dirtiest, most dangerous aspect of my profession. He was now the proud sole owner of a commercial toxic waste site. The heavy, unforgiving burden of the working class he hated so deeply had just dropped directly onto his tailored shoulders. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, savoring its bold flavor as a blue heron glided gracefully across the water. "I'm not hitting anyone, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked breathing like a scalpel, with unwavering precision. "There is absolutely no fraud here. You drafted the quitclaim deed. You brought your own lawyer. You chose the signing location. You threatened me with a spliced video and practically forced the pen into my hand. I just gave you exactly what you demanded." Julian made a choking, desperate sound, his breathing growing rapid and shallow. "You knew about those chemicals," he accused, his voice trembling with terror. "You intentionally hid the environmental status of the property." I let out a short, cold laugh. "The environmental status of that property is a matter of public record, Julian. It's been registered with the federal government for years. Any competent financial advisor or real estate attorney would have pulled the property disclosures and municipal zoning history before demanding a direct, unprotected transfer of title. But you were too busy looking down your nose at me to bother checking basic legal facts." I paused, letting a heavy silence stretch across the line, ensuring he heard every single word that came next. "汇丰银行总是表现得好像你是房间里最聪明的人. You loved playing the brilliant, highly educated financial guru against me, the naive, simple-minded, blue-collar electrician. Well, Mr. Hayes, you're the smart guy. You're the financial genius. Why don't you look at the fine print on your bill of sale? Why didn't you do a basic title search before you stole my house?" The sheer humiliation packed into my words was the final, devastating blow to his fractured ego. The line went dead silent for a split second, and then Julian completely unraveled. He let out a deep, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire existence was over. "Where are you?" he screamed, his voice tearing at his vocal cords. "Where are you hiding, you old piece of garbage? I'm going to find you, and I'm going to end you." I simply pressed the end call button and placed the phone face down on the patio table. Miles away, standing in the driveway of his toxic nightmare, Julian violently smashed his phone onto the grass. He shoved Chloe aside, nearly ripping the door off her luxury rental SUV. He slammed his foot onto the gas, the heavy engine roaring as he sped out of the neighborhood in a blind, murderous rage, vowing to hunt me down. I watched the final act of Julian's arrogant rampage begin to unfold through the live feed of my perimeter security cameras. During his manic episode, he must have pulled my trust corporation registration documents to find my physical address. He no longer cared about subtle covers or legal boundaries. His black luxury SUV tore down the tree-lined private road, leading to my estate at a dangerous speed. When he reached my imposing wrought iron security gates, he didn't even tap the brakes. He slammed the accelerator, ramming the 2-ton vehicle directly into the metal barriers. The impact was deafening. The front bumper of his luxury vehicle crumpled like cheap tin foil, and the headlights shattered into 1,000 pieces. But the massive force broke the electronic hinges. He skidded onto my pristine circular driveway, tearing up the expensive landscaped lawn before violently throwing the ruined vehicle into park. Chloe was in the passenger seat, clearly infected by his manic, desperate energy during the drive. Julian kicked his door open and marched to the back of the smoking SUV. He popped the trunk and ripped out a massive, heavy steel sledgehammer. His face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, homicidal fury. He stomped up the wide stone steps leading to my grand entryway. Chloe stumbled out of the passenger side, standing on the ruined turf in her expensive heels. "Get him, Julian!" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "Make that selfish old bastard sign the deed back. Don't let him ruin our lives, and just get away with it." Julian didn't hesitate. He raised the heavy steel hammer high above his head and brought it down with all his might, smashing it directly into my custom floor-to-ceiling glass front door. The reinforced glass held against the first blow, spiderwebbing with a massive, violent cracking sound. Roaring like a wild animal, Julian swung the sledgehammer again and again until the glass finally gave way, sending sharp shards raining down onto my polished marble foyer. He stomped his expensive leather shoes over the shattered frame, crushing the glass, gripping the sledgehammer as he screamed my name at the top of his lungs into the quiet house. I stood perfectly still on the interior second-floor balcony, looking down at the grand foyer. I held my control tablet in my hand, my thumb hovering over the master interface. Julian genuinely believed he had broken into the soft, vulnerable home of a retired, defenseless old man. He thought this estate was nothing more than a pretty architectural showpiece equipped with a standard store-bought residential alarm system. He was making the exact same arrogant mistake he had made his entire life. He severely underestimated the quiet, calculated mind of a blue-collar tradesman. Over my 40-year career, my industrial electrical firm didn't just service basic office buildings. We held massive, highly classified government contracts. We laid the primary power grids and security conduits for maximum security Federal Reserve banks, pharmaceutical research labs, and state correctional facilities. I spent decades studying the highest echelons of commercial security architecture because I had to route heavy cables directly through their blast walls and underground vaults. When I built this estate for myself out of a former civil defense shelter, I didn't hire standard residential contractors to handle the security protocols. I personally designed and installed a Class 4 commercial security matrix, seamlessly integrating military-grade defense mechanisms into the elegant framework of the house. Beneath the pristine white drywall lay reinforced titanium support beams. The massive picture windows overlooking the lake weren't standard glass. They were 2-inch thick ballistic polymers, designed to withstand sustained gunfire and explosive impacts. The entire property was an impenetrable fortress disguised as a tranquil luxury retreat. Julian thought he had forced his way past my defenses by shattering a single panel of glass with a piece of iron. He had no idea the perimeter glass was specifically designed to act as a funnel. I wanted him to break in. I intentionally left the front entrance unreinforced, so he would plunge deep into my domain. He hadn't broken into my sanctuary. He had voluntarily walked directly into a highly sophisticated, inescapable vault. Julian strode toward the center of my massive living room, swinging the sledgehammer into a priceless ceramic vase sitting on an entryway table. The vase shattered into dust, scattering across the expensive Persian rug. "Where are you, Arthur?" Julian roared, his voice echoing harshly off the high, vaulted ceilings. "Come down here right now and sign the deed back over. If you don't reverse that federal contract right now, I will beat you half to death." Outside on the lawn, Chloe was jumping up and down, completely swept up in the violent adrenaline of the moment. "Tear this place apart until he comes out," she screamed through the shattered doorway. "Find his safe. Make him pay." I looked down at the pathetic, violent display from the safety of the second floor. I didn't feel a single ounce of fear or hesitation. What I felt was the cold, mechanical precision of absolute justice. With a steady hand, I pressed a large red icon on my tablet. The entire house responded with a terrifying, instantaneous violence. Deafening 130-decibel commercial security sirens blasted from hidden speakers in every corner of the ceilings. The noise was physically painful, engineered to completely disorient and incapacitate armed intruders. Blinding, high-intensity strobe lights began flashing rapidly from the recessed fixtures, throwing the living room into a chaotic, strobe-lit nightmare. Julian screamed in pain, clapping his hands over his ears, completely blinded by the relentless flashes. Immediately following the audio assault came the heavy mechanical grind of engaging industrial machinery. Solid, 2-inch thick, interlocking steel security shutters dropped rapidly from hidden tracks above every single window and exterior door on the first floor. They slammed into reinforced floor-locking mechanisms with a synchronized, earth-shaking thud. A massive steel security grate dropped vertically directly across the shattered front entrance, instantly sealing the breach. Chloe screamed in terror as the metal wall slammed down inches from her face, completely cutting her off from her husband. In a single second, Julian was trapped inside a windowless, inescapable steel box. I stepped forward, walking all the way to the edge of the interior balcony. The railing wasn't open. It was completely sealed by a solid floor-to-ceiling wall of tempered, ballistic polymer glass. I stood there, bathed in the flashing emergency lights, looking down at the man who had assaulted me with a heavy brass lamp just days before. Julian stumbled blindly, coughing in the dusty air, violently swinging the sledgehammer against the steel shutters, blocking the front exit. The heavy metal didn't even take a dent. The hammer bounced straight off, sending a painful shockwave through his arms. He dropped the weapon, his chest heaving with pure panic, and looked up at the second floor. He saw me standing behind the impenetrable barrier, perfectly calm and completely untouchable. I just crossed my arms, watching his arrogant bluff shatter into a million tiny pieces. Suddenly, cutting through the deafening house alarm, a different sound pierced the morning air. The high-pitched, aggressive wail of multiple police sirens echoed from a distance. The sound multiplied, closing in rapidly from both ends of my private drive. There was no back door. There was no hidden escape route. The only exit was completely blocked by a wall of approaching blue lights. 4 heavy police cruisers screeched to a halt across the torn turf of my front lawn, their tires ripping deep tracks into the manicured grass. The deafening sirens cut out instantly, replaced by the sharp, crackling static of police radios and the heavy slam of car doors. A dozen officers poured out with their weapons drawn, responding to the automated commercial distress signal. My security system had routed the alert straight to the local precinct. The flashing red and blue lights cast chaotic, frantic strokes across the steel-plated exterior of my house. Out on the lawn, the moment Chloe saw the uniforms, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. The aggressive, hostile woman who had just been screaming for her husband to tear my house apart completely vanished. In her place stood a fragile, hysterical victim. She rushed toward the commanding officer, her hands raised in the air, sobbing violently. She pointed a trembling finger at the massive steel grate covering the front entrance. "You have to save my husband," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured terror. "My father has completely lost his mind. He has severe dementia, and he lured us out here. He trapped Julian inside that metal box, and he's going to hurt him. Please, you have to break down that wall and save him. He's holding them hostage." The officers, evaluating the reinforced fortress and the crying woman in expensive clothes, immediately took defensive positions behind their vehicles. They called out to me over a megaphone, ordering me to deactivate the security locks, raise my hands, and step outside. Standing behind the ballistic glass on the second floor, looking down at the daughter I had raised, I felt a cold, hollow ache sink deep into my chest. This was the definitive moment. This was the absolute final severing of our blood ties. Any lingering, foolish hope I had held that Chloe was just a victim, manipulated by Julian, dissolved entirely in the sterile air of my stronghold. I watched her cry, gesturing frantically, actively feeding calculated lies to armed police officers, lies that could easily lead to a tactical raid on my home or cost me my life. I thought about the decades I had spent sacrificing my own comfort for her well-being. I remembered working overtime in flooded municipal basements just to afford her elite private school tuition. I remembered sitting in the front row of her college graduation, my eyes full of proud tears, believing I had successfully given her the tools to be a strong, honorable woman. I gave her everything, and in return she stood on my ruined lawn, desperately trying to manufacture a felony charge against me just to protect a failed abusive fraud. Watching your own flesh and blood actively plot how to destroy you is a unique, suffocating kind of torment. It burns through your memories, leaving nothing but ash. But as I watched Chloe wipe away her fake tears, that pain hardened into a permanent, unbreakable resolve. Martha had been completely right. Our daughter had been entirely consumed by greed. She was no longer the little girl who used to wait for my truck to pull into the driveway. She was a hostile adversary. I didn't feel anger anymore. I only felt a mechanical, relentless necessity to finish the lesson I had started. I was going to let the justice system completely dismantle the reality she had fabricated. The commander raised the megaphone again, his voice booming across the property, demanding that I release the lockdown. Before I could even reach for the control tablet to lower the volume of the house alarm, a sleek silver luxury sedan glided calmly around the perimeter of the police cruisers, parking neatly at the edge of the driveway. The driver's door opened, and Victor Vance stepped into the chaotic scene. My lawyer didn't look alarmed. He looked like a man arriving at a highly anticipated business meeting. He straightened his suit jacket, grabbed his premium leather briefcase, and walked right past a weeping Chloe without giving her a single glance. He walked straight toward the commanding officer with absolute, unwavering authority. "Officer, tell your men to stand down and lower their weapons," Victor stated, his voice carrying that unmistakable sharpness of a high-powered corporate attorney giving directions to a federal judge. "There is no hostage situation taking place on this property. The man trapped inside the security vestibule is a violent intruder, and the woman crying on the lawn is his willing accomplice." The commander frowned, lowering his megaphone, but kept his hand near his holster. "And who exactly are you?" the officer questioned. Victor snapped open his briefcase, pulling out a thick, legally certified document stamped with the official seal of the Washington State Supreme Court. "I am Victor Vance, senior legal counsel for Mr. Arthur Crawford, the sole owner of this estate. What your men are currently responding to is a textbook case of breaking and entering alongside malicious property damage." Victor handed the paperwork directly to the officer. 2 days ago, a Superior Court judge reviewed high-definition security footage of that man violently assaulting my client with a metal lamp, followed by footage of him attempting to kick down my client's front door at 2 in the morning. The judge immediately granted a permanent, zero-tolerance restraining order. This document explicitly bans Julian Hayes and Chloe Hayes from coming within 500 feet of Mr. Crawford or any residential property registered under his corporate trusts. The commander scanned the legal documents, his eyes widening as he read the strict judicial mandates and the specific vehicle descriptions listed in the order. He looked up from the paperwork, his gaze shifting from Victor to the smoking, wrecked luxury SUV jammed into my wrought iron gates, and finally landing on Chloe. Chloe's fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She realized the trap was completely inescapable. Watching from the balcony, I pressed a single button on the tablet. The massive steel grate covering the front entrance began to rise slowly with a heavy mechanical hum. Julian immediately stumbled out onto the front porch, dropping the sledgehammer, gasping for fresh air and raising his hands toward the police in a gesture of desperate relief. "Thank God," Julian coughed, pointing up toward my second-floor window. "Arrest that crazy old bastard. He locked me in there." The officers didn't look up at me. Moving with swift, tactical precision, they grabbed Julian by both arms, spun him around violently, and slammed his face hard against the side of a cruiser. For the second time in a single week, the cold, unforgiving steel of police handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. "You're under arrest for felony breaking and entering, malicious destruction of property, and a severe violation of a permanent judicial protection order," the commander barked, pinning Julian firmly against the hood. "And this time, there is absolutely no option for bail." Victor and I followed the police convoy down to the precinct in downtown Seattle. I wasn't sitting in the back of a squad car. I sat in the plush passenger seat of Victor's luxury sedan, sipping a fresh bottle of sparkling water, while my corporate attorney reviewed his meticulously organized case files. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the highway, casting a rhythmic glow across the asphalt. When we arrived at the high-security station, the chief of police met us personally at the secure side entrance. He escorted us directly into a private, soundproof observation room. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh fluorescent light spilling through a massive one-way mirror built into the concrete wall. On the other side of the reinforced glass sat Julian. He was locked inside a bare, windowless interrogation room, his hands cuffed tightly to a heavy metal table bolted to the floor. The expensive custom suit he cherished so deeply was completely ruined. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, covered in wrinkles, and coated in a thick layer of dust from my steel security shutters. The arrogant mask of the Wall Street elite had completely evaporated in the sterile precinct air. He was no longer the smug financial master who had thrown a heavy lamp at my head. He was a trapped, terrified animal, facing the absolute destruction of his entire life. Two seasoned detectives walked into the room, slamming a massive stack of federal and state files onto the metal table with a chilling, booming thud. Before they could even begin their formal questioning, Julian completely broke under the immense psychological pressure. He leaned forward, sweating profusely under the harsh lights, and began frantically throwing the woman he had sworn to love and protect entirely under the bus. "It was all Chloe!" Julian yelled, his voice cracking with cowardly desperation and panic. "You have to believe me. She's the one who forced us to move into his house because our estate was going into foreclosure. She's the one who drafted that fake power of attorney and told me to make him sign it at the lawyer's office. I'm just a financial advisor. I don't know anything about real estate fraud or toxic waste dumps. She manipulated me because she wanted his money to fund her shopping habits." He sat there crying real, pathetic tears, actively trying to send my daughter to a federal prison for decades, just to shave a few years off his own inevitable sentence. He claimed he was a helpless victim of family manipulation, entirely unaware of the highly illegal actions taken against my property. He painted himself as a naive, loyal husband who was simply trying to support his greedy, malicious wife. I stood perfectly still in the observation room, watching the absolute cowardice radiating from the man across the glass. I didn't feel a single shred of pity or hesitation for him. I only felt a deep, gut-wrenching disgust. Martha had been entirely right about him from the very beginning. He was a parasite who cared about nothing but his own survival. Victor stood right beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the pathetic display with the detached calmness of an apex predator observing trapped prey. As Julian continued to spin his frantic web of blatant lies to the detectives, Victor calmly reached into his premium leather briefcase. He pulled out a small, highly encrypted digital storage drive and handed it directly to the chief of police standing next to us. The chief raised an eyebrow, questioning the contents of the device. Victor didn't smile. He simply instructed the chief to have his detectives play the primary audio file labeled medical fraud right in front of the suspect. That specific digital drive contained the raw, high-fidelity audio recording I had captured when Eris visited my home days before. Anticipating that Julian would inevitably try to lie his way out of any legal corner, I had methodically gathered the exact proof to strip away his defenses before he even had a chance to build them. When Julian aggressively bribed that notorious fraudulent investigator to fabricate a severe dementia diagnosis, he thought he had executed a perfect, untraceable white-collar crime. He assumed that because I wore faded work boots and spent my life laying industrial high-voltage grids, I was too simple to understand the complexities of medical fraud or corporate extortion. He never expected that the quiet old electrician he constantly mocked possessed the technical capability to record his illegal dealings. He never realized that the $15,000 crypto bribe he handed Eris was a direct confession perfectly captured by a digital microphone secured underneath my kitchen table. Eris had loudly and explicitly named Julian as the sole financier of the fraudulent evaluation. He outlined the exact amount Julian paid him to force me out of my own home and lock me inside a specialized care facility. That recording wasn't just circumstantial evidence. It was an ironclad, undeniable confession proving Julian was the primary mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. He wasn't his wife's victim. He was a cold, calculating criminal actively purchasing fraudulent medical documents to steal a multi-million-dollar estate and cover his catastrophic federal tax debt. Through the glass, I watched the lead detective press his hand to his earpiece microphone, receiving the direct order from our chief in the observation room. The detective gave a slight nod, raised a firm hand, and cut off Julian's frantic, tearful monologue. He pulled a small digital media player from his pocket, plugged it into a portable speaker on the metal table, and pressed play. Eris's clear, crisp voice instantly filled the bare interrogation room. Julian was absolutely right. The investigator's recorded voice chuckled with arrogant satisfaction. You're completely gone, old man. You don't even know what decade you're living in. This is going to be the easiest 15 grand I've ever made in my career. The recording echoed harshly off the concrete walls. Julian's mouth hung wide open. The color drained from his face instantly, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The frantic energy he used to push Chloe off the cliff vanished entirely, replaced by an absolute suffocating terror. He stared at that small speaker as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. The detective leaned forward, his hands flat on the metal desk, inches from Julian's face. You were saying something about having zero knowledge of this fraud? The detective said, his voice dripping with heavy, unmistakable sarcasm. Because this audio file, just submitted as official state evidence by Mr. Crawford's legal team, explicitly names you as the only one orchestrating a $15,000 bribe to a corrupt medical official. We also have the encrypted withdrawal logs from your remaining unfrozen accounts that match the date and amount of this specific bribe perfectly. The detective paused, letting the overwhelming weight of the evidence settle completely onto Julian's trembling shoulders. You're not a victim of your wife, Julian. You're the architect of a multiple extortion conspiracy against a senior citizen. Your entire statement today is a recorded lie, and you just committed perjury by giving a false sworn statement to federal investigators. Julian began to hyperventilate. He tugged frantically at his steel handcuffs, his chest heaving with the inescapable realization of his downfall. He had no defense left. He had no high-priced lawyers to bail him out. He had no money left to bribe judges. He was completely and utterly undone by the man he thought was too foolish to strike back. Julian slumped back in his metal chair, pressing his forehead against the cold table, letting out a pathetic, defeated whimper. I'll cooperate, he sobbed heavily, his last shred of dignity dissolving in the sterile precinct air. I'll testify against her in court. I'll tell you everything about how Chloe helped me hide funds in offshore accounts. Just promise to protect me from a maximum security federal facility, and I'll sign whatever you want. The lead detective didn't offer a comforting smile. He simply stood up straight, looking down at the broken man with utter contempt. You don't have any leverage left to bargain with, Julian, the detective said coldly. And you should probably know your wife isn't sitting down in a holding cell. We placed her in the observation room next door, and we turned the intercom speakers all the way up. She just sat right there and listened to you beg us to send her to a federal prison, just to save your own skin. The detective picked up his case files and walked toward the heavy iron door. She's cooperating fully with the district attorney, the detective added, looking back over his shoulder. And she asked for a pen. She's signing the divorce papers right now. The fluorescent lights in the county courthouse hallway gave off a dull, sterile hum, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany benches. Exactly 3 weeks had passed since the violent confrontation in my living room, and the preliminary hearing for the felony assault charges had finally arrived. I sat in the very front row of the gallery, wearing a crisp, tailored deep gray suit, waiting patiently for the court proceedings to begin. When the heavy side wooden doors opened, 2 armed bailiffs escorted Julian into the courtroom. His transformation was absolute and pathetic. He was no longer wearing his custom Italian suits or flaunting his expensive luxury watches. He wore a standard, oversized Orange County jail jumpsuit, his wrists bound together by heavy iron chains. He looked pale and gaunt, his trademark Wall Street arrogance completely stripped away. He shuffled toward the defense table, his eyes locked onto the floor, lacking the courage to even look in my direction. With all of his assets completely frozen by the IRS, he couldn't afford the high-powered defense team he desperately needed. Instead, he was represented by a public defender who looked completely overworked and thoroughly exhausted by the mountain of federal and state charges facing his client. As the judge called the court to order, Julian's defense lawyer immediately launched into a frantic, desperate defense, trying to minimize the severity of the crime. He paced before the judge, gesturing wildly, trying to paint a picture of a loving family pushed to the absolute edge by modern financial stress. "Your Honor," the public defender pleaded, his voice echoing through the quiet courtroom, "my client is a hard-working financial broker who was experiencing unprecedented professional anxiety. What happened in that house was not a calculated malicious assault. It was a highly emotional domestic dispute that unfortunately escalated. It was a temporary lapse in judgment." The defense lawyer pointed toward me, attempting to twist the narrative to make me look like the provocateur. He argued that my injuries were minor, requiring only a few stitches, and that under the specific context of a family conflict, a vintage brass lamp should not be classified as a deadly weapon. He practically begged the judge to reduce the felony aggravated assault charge to simple misdemeanor assault, claiming that sending a man with no prior record to state prison over a family misunderstanding would be an absolute miscarriage of justice. I listened to his ridiculous manufactured narrative without letting a single trace of emotion show on my face. When the prosecutor finally called my name, I stood up slowly, straightened my suit jacket, and walked toward the witness stand with calm, measured steps. I raised my right hand and placed my left on the Bible, swearing to tell the whole truth. I took my seat in the wooden chair, resting my calloused, scarred hands on the railing. The defense attorney immediately tried to rattle my composure. He stepped close to the stand aggressively, launching a rapid series of leading questions designed to make me look like a difficult, uncooperative, stubborn old man who deliberately provoked his stressed son-in-law. He asked if I held a deep-seated resentment toward Julian. He asked if I intentionally insulted his profession to trigger a physical alteration. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or let his aggressive tactics bait me into an emotional defense. I looked right past the frantic lawyer, focusing my eyes entirely on the judge. I spoke with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who had spent 40 years building industrial electrical infrastructure through honest, heavy labor. I explained the exact sequence of events with absolute chilling clarity. "I am a 71-year-old man," I stated, my voice echoing deeply throughout the silent courtroom. I was sitting quietly inside the house I bought and paid for with decades of manual labor. My daughter and her husband entered my home uninvited, dropped their luggage onto the floor, and ordered me out of my own master bedroom to live in the attic. When I calmly refused their unreasonable demands, he resorted to direct, extreme violence. I didn't exaggerate the pain of the impact. I didn't try to force fake tears from my eyes to win the court's sympathy. I simply stated the undeniable facts. A younger, significantly stronger man grabbed a heavy, solid metal object and swung it directly at my skull with maximum force, solely because I refused to hand over my private property. My absolute composure, steady voice, and unwavering gaze completely overwhelmed the defense attorney's deceptive narrative. The lawyer visibly deflated, realizing he could not bully or confuse a man who had no fear and nothing to hide. The prosecutor then stood up to address the judge. "Your Honor, the state requests to enter Exhibit A into the official record," the prosecutor announced confidently. "We possess the unedited high-definition security footage captured directly from the camera in Mr. Crawford's living room at the exact date and time of the incident." The judge nodded. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly, and a large flat-screen television was rolled into the center of the room. Julian shrank deep into his chair, burying his face in his chained hands as the video began to play. The recording played with stark, undeniable, and brutal clarity. The judge and the entire gallery watched Julian storm into the frame, his face twisted into a mask of pure, privileged fury. They heard the crystal-clear audio of his verbal abuse, listening to him call me an uneducated old laborer. Then they saw the exact moment he grabbed that heavy brass desk lamp. The video completely shattered the defense attorney's argument that this was a reckless, accidental toss, born out of sudden stress. The high-definition footage showed Julian, with his feet firmly planted on the hardwood floor, winding his arms back, and launching that solid metal object directly at my head with maximum intent and speed. An audible gasp rippled through the courtroom. The video showed the fixtures smashing heavily against my forehead, my blood instantly pouring down my neck and staining my shirt. It displayed the pure cruelty of a young man trying to inflict maximum physical harm on a senior citizen. Equally devastating was the footage capturing Chloe standing frozen in the background. It showed her actively refusing to offer any medical assistance as her bleeding father stood before her, choosing instead to scream and accuse me of being selfish. The defense attorney threw his pen onto the table and shook his head. He knew his entire defense had been completely destroyed by a cold digital reality of malicious, highly premeditated aggression. When the courtroom lights came back on, the defense lawyer made one final desperate plea to the judge. He requested that Julian be allowed bail until the final criminal trial, arguing that he needed to go home to prepare his legal defense and handle his complex financial affairs. The prosecutor immediately objected, citing the extreme violence demonstrated in the video. The judge didn't even bother to look up from her legal notes. She picked up her heavy gavel and brought it down against the block with a sharp, echoing crack, sealing Julian's fate. Based on the extremely violent and unprovoked nature of the assault on a senior citizen, the judge announced, her voice carrying the absolute finality of a definitive ruling, and combined with the active federal indictments the defendant is facing regarding international wire fraud, offshore shell accounts, and massive outstanding debt to the IRS. I find this man to be a severe flight risk and a serious danger to the community. Bail is absolutely denied. The defendant will be remanded to the county jail until his trial date. Take him out of my courtroom. The early morning sun reflected brilliantly across my private lake, casting a warm golden glow over the estate's cedar deck. I was standing in my spacious kitchen, pouring myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, when the automated chime of the perimeter security system broke the absolute silence. I walked over to the wall-mounted control panel and pulled up the live video feed from the main entrance gate. Standing on the other side of the heavy wrought iron barrier was my daughter. Chloe had somehow tracked down the heavily guarded address of my corporate trust. She no longer looked like the entitled, arrogant woman who had stood on my front porch weeks ago, demanding that I pack my bags for the attic. Her expensive designer clothes looked wrinkled and slept in. Her usually meticulously styled hair was tied back in a messy, careless knot. Her face was pale, completely devoid of makeup, exposing deep, dark circles of extreme exhaustion and panic. She repeatedly pressed the intercom button with trembling fingers, staring directly into the camera lens with wide, desperate eyes. I didn't press the release button to let her in. I put on my jacket, walked out the front door, and made my way down the long, paved driveway toward the security gate with slow, deliberate steps. When I reached the heavy iron bars, Chloe instantly dropped to her knees on the hard, decorative cobblestones. She gripped the metal bars with both hands, sobbing uncontrollably as tears fell freely onto the pavement. "Dad, you have to help me," she wailed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "Please, you're my last hope. The EPA is ruining my life. Julian is locked in a county jail cell without bail, and because we haven't legally finalized the divorce, the government is coming after me for that toxic waste fine. They placed a $1.5 million lien on that house. I don't have that kind of money. My accounts are completely frozen because of Julian's tax fraud. I'm going to be arrested." She pressed her face against the cold iron bars, playing the ultimate victim card. "You know I had no idea what was going on. Julian manipulated me. He controlled our finances. He lied to me about how successful he was, and he forced me to treat you like that. You know I love you. Please, Dad, you have to save your little girl." I stood on my side of the gate, looking down at the weeping woman who had once stood by, and watched her husband smash a heavy metal lamp into my skull. I felt absolutely no warmth. I felt no protective fatherly instinct. Her tears were completely empty, born entirely out of self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. I didn't reach through the bars to comfort her. Instead, I calmly reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily weathered, leather-bound accounting ledger. It was an old physical record book I had perfectly maintained for over a decade. I slid the heavy ledger out through the gap in the iron gate. It landed heavily on the cobblestones directly in front of Chloe's knees, with a dull, definitive thud. "Open it," I commanded, my voice devoid of emotion. "Read the highlighted transaction on the very first page." Chloe sniffled, wiping her face with the back of her trembling hand. She slowly reached out, opened the worn leather cover, and looked at the faded ink. 10 years ago, Julian was a failed, incompetent junior analyst who had just been fired from his first corporate job. He was completely broke, drowning in student debt, and entirely incapable of securing a traditional, commercial loan to start his own crypto venture capital firm. He told Chloe and everyone who would listen that a brilliant, anonymous angel investor had recognized his undeniable talent, generously providing $2 million in seed capital to launch his entire career. Julian had built his entire arrogant Wall Street elite identity around the myth that he was a self-made business prodigy. "Look at the name of the holding company that issued that initial $2 million wire transfer," I instructed, watching her eyes scan across the page. Chloe read the corporate entity listed in the old ledger, and then her gaze slowly traced the ownership lineage I had handwritten right next to it. The color drained from her face completely. She let out a sharp, suffocating gasp. The anonymous angel investor wasn't some Wall Street billionaire. It was a blind trust funded and controlled entirely by a blue-collar industrial electrician named Arthur Crawford. Every custom suit Julian had ever worn, every expensive dinner he bought to impress his superficial friends, the luxury cars he leased, the downtown penthouse he flaunted, all of it had been paid for in full by the dirt, wires, and high-voltage capacitors he had so viciously mocked. "I bought his career," I stated, the cold truth cutting through the morning air like a surgical knife. "Your husband never built a single thing in his entire life. The only reason I quietly funded his entire firm was because Martha begged me on her deathbed to ensure your financial security. I gave him the foundation to be a massive success, but instead of building something honorable, he used my money to construct a fraudulent, arrogant illusion. He spent 10 years looking down on the man who put food on his table. And you, Chloe, you stood right beside him, completely blinded by fake wealth, actively choosing a worthless parasite over the father who sacrificed his own body to give you the world." Chloe stared at the ledger, her hands shaking violently. The reality of her entire adult life had just been utterly demolished. The absolute superiority she had felt over my modest, working-class lifestyle was exposed as a humiliating, massive joke. She had discarded a loyal father for a man who was actually surviving on my silent charity. "But, Dad," Chloe stammered, her voice barely a whisper, "if you have this much wealth, if you're this powerful, then you can fix this EPA disaster right now. You can clear the federal fine easily. You can hire the best lawyers in the country to separate my name from Julian's criminal indictments. You can save me from prison. Please, just wire the money. It wouldn't even be a drop in the bucket for you." I looked down at her, maintaining absolute freezing eye contact. I could erase that $1.5 million environmental debt with a single snap of my fingers, I said, my voice echoing with deep, unshakable authority. I could make one phone call to Victor and have your entire legal nightmare vanish before lunch. It wouldn't even leave a visible dent in my financial portfolio. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute finality of what I was about to say next. "But I refuse. I will not give you a single penny." Chloe let out a devastating, heartbroken wail, gripping the iron bars tighter. "Why?" she screamed, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Because you need to understand the true cost of your greed," I replied coldly. "You demanded my house. You demanded my property. You demanded that I crawl into a windowless attic so you two could live comfortably on my dime. Well, now you have exactly what you wanted. That toxic, hazardous house, that massive, overwhelming federal debt, and the absolute permanent ruin of your fake corporate lifestyle. This is my final dowry to you. You chose your husband. You chose his arrogance, his fraud, and his blatant disrespect. You chose your path, Chloe. Now you have to walk it entirely alone." I turned on my heel and began a slow walk back down the long paved driveway toward my tranquil estate. Chloe screamed my name, begging me to come back, her hands reaching desperately through the iron bars. I didn't look back. I didn't break my stride. As I reached the front steps of my house, a modest, unmarked silver sedan pulled up to the curb, right behind the street where Chloe was kneeling. A man wearing a plain gray suit stepped out of the vehicle holding a thick, bright yellow manila envelope. He walked straight toward my weeping daughter. "Chloe Hayes?" the man asked, his tone entirely professional and devoid of sympathy. Chloe slowly raised her head, her eyes red and swollen, too exhausted to even form a response. The man simply dropped the heavy yellow envelope directly onto her lap. "You've been officially served," he announced loudly, turning back toward his vehicle. "You are required to appear for a grand jury indictment regarding international wire fraud. Have a wonderful morning." The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle shut with a resounding boom, sealing the courtroom in a tense, suffocating silence. Exactly 3 weeks had passed since Chloe was served on the driveway of my estate. Today was the final financial reckoning. I sat in the second row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight inside a flawless navy blue suit. Victor Vance sat right beside me, silently observing the masterpiece of legal destruction we had orchestrated together. Standing at the prosecution table was the lead counsel for the IRS and the SEC. He was a tall, cold government attorney holding a thick binder containing the entire forged history of Julian's financial dealings. The federal judge, a stern woman who clearly had zero patience for white-collar criminals, adjusted her glasses and read the final asset forfeiture decree. The words coming from her mouth echoed through the hollow room like the steady, rhythmic beat of an absolute doom. The IRS had successfully pierced the corporate veil of Julian's offshore shell companies. The judge officially declared a total freeze and seizure of every single financial asset tied to Julian and Chloe. Their lavish waterfront estate in Mercer Island was officially seized by the bank. The leased luxury fleet was repossessed by the dealerships. The crypto accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely drained and routed back into the U.S. Treasury to satisfy the massive tax evasion fines. Chloe sat frozen at the defense table, burying her face in her hands. She listened as the federal government systematically stripped away every piece of luxury, every designer handbag, and every stolen dollar she had once foolishly believed elevated her above her working-class father. The illusion of their grand wealth was officially dead, replaced by the absolute, inescapable reality of zero. I shifted my gaze to Julian. The man standing before the federal judge was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, sneering real estate crypto mogul who had violently demanded that I move into my own attic. Because the local magistrate explicitly denied his bail after viewing the security footage of his unprovoked assault on me, Julian had been rotting in a county jail cell for the last few weeks. The harsh, unforgiving reality of incarceration had completely broken his spirit. He wore a faded, oversized orange prison jumpsuit that practically swallowed his shrunken frame. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy chains that let out a loud, rhythmic clink against the polished hardwood floor every time he nervously shifted his weight. The expensive, meticulously styled haircut he once flaunted was now a greasy, overgrown mess. The dark circles beneath his eyes looked like permanent, severe bruises. Visibly, he was shaking. The man who had mocked the calluses on my hands, who had sneeringly called me an uneducated old electrician while drinking premium scotch stolen from my private cabinet, was now reduced to a pathetic, shivering shell of a human being. He had lost his prestigious firm. He had lost his fake reputation. He had lost the respect of his superficial associates, who had abandoned him the exact second the federal indictments became a matter of public record. The gallery benches behind me were packed with local reporters and financial bloggers, all typing frantically on their laptops, permanently fixing the destruction of his public image into the digital archives of the internet. I looked at his trembling hands and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of quiet satisfaction. Martha had begged me to protect our daughter from this parasite. I had done exactly that by letting the parasite consume itself. Julian had spent his entire adult life looking down on honest working-class labor. Now he was physically looking up at a federal judge, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. The federal prosecutor flipped a page in his ledger, addressing the court regarding the final disposition of the defendant's remaining property. The IRS is seizing all liquid assets, all offshore accounts, and all equity in the downtown Seattle properties to satisfy the $1.5 million tax debt, the prosecutor stated clearly. However, the government officially declines to seize the residential property in Snoqualmie, recently transferred to the defendant's name. The judge nodded in agreement. The IRS is an incredibly efficient collection agency, and they have zero interest in acquiring toxic liabilities. By obtaining direct ownership of my former home through that fraudulent quitclaim deed, Julian had legally bound himself to the federally registered commercial hazardous materials staging site located in the barn. The government wouldn't touch that property. It was legally contaminated. This meant that the suburban mountain lodge, containing the looming $1.5 million environmental cleanup invoice from the EPA, was the only isolated asset Julian and Chloe now legally owned. The judge looked down at Julian with absolute unyielding disdain. Mr. Hayes, you possess zero liquid capital. You are facing significant federal prison time for wire fraud and securities violations, and you are jointly and severally liable for a $1.5 million federal environmental fine, the judge declared firmly. You are completely and utterly insolvent. Julian's public defender stood up, his voice weak and defeated, to officially request the court's permission for his client to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The judge granted the request, but immediately delivered the final, devastating blow. You may file for bankruptcy to liquidate your remaining consumer debts, the judge clarified coldly. But as your counsel should have informed you, federal environmental fines issued by the Environmental Protection Agency are absolutely non-dischargeable under any bankruptcy proceedings. This specific debt will follow you for the rest of your natural life. Julian's body went completely limp in his wooden chair, and he buried his face in his chained hands. He had absolutely nothing left. He was penniless, ruined, burdened with an inescapable $1.5 million debt, and facing a definitive 5-year sentence in a maximum security federal facility. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel against the block with a sharp bang, officially adjourning the financial hearing and remanding Julian back to the county jail to await his final criminal sentencing. 2 armed bailiffs stepped forward, grabbing Julian roughly by the arms to drag him back to his concrete cell. As they turned him toward the central aisle, his hollow, sunken eyes scanned across the crowded gallery, locking his gaze directly onto mine. I sat perfectly still, my expression calm and completely unbothered. Julian stopped walking, ignoring the heavy pull of the bailiffs on his shoulders. His chest heaved as the absolute, overwhelming reality of his total destruction finally connected in his mind. He looked at my crisp suit, and then his eyes drifted to the fading scar on my forehead, the exact spot where he had smashed me with that metal lamp. "Did you plan all of this from that exact day?" Julian asked, his voice raspy and broken, barely carrying over the murmur of the courtroom crowd. I stared directly into his eyes, ensuring that my words would haunt him every single night he spent behind bars. "I planned it long before you ever picked up that lamp," I answered. The heavy chains let out a sickening rhythmic clank as the armed bailiffs dragged Julian through the heavy side wooden doors of the courtroom. The heavy latch clicked into place, echoing sharply through the empty mahogany-paneled space. Julian was gone, dragged back to a miserable concrete cell to await his inevitable transfer to a federal penitentiary. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the whispers of financial reporters and legal clerks, suddenly fell dead silent. Chloe stood frozen at the defense table while the devastating asset forfeiture decree was read. But the moment the doors slammed shut behind her husband, her shock instantly turned into a blinding, irrational fury. She snapped out of her daze, her chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor. She marched down the central aisle, her high heels making an aggressive clicking sound against the wood as she walked straight toward the section of the gallery where Victor and I were sitting. "You monster!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with a savage, hysterical rage that caused every remaining reporter in the room to instantly point their digital recorders in her direction. "You cold-blooded, heartless monster!" She didn't care about the audience. She didn't care about the federal marshals standing near the exits. She thrust a trembling, pointing finger directly at my chest, her face twisted with pure hatred. "You planned this entire nightmare just to destroy us. You set a trap so we would lose everything. What kind of father does this to his own flesh and blood? You have tens of millions of dollars stashed away in hidden bank accounts, and you just sit there watching my husband get chained up like an animal. You ruined my life. You are completely out of your mind, Arthur." She intentionally dropped the word dad, addressing me strictly by my first name as if I were nothing more than a hostile business adversary executing a cold corporate takeover. She blamed me for the federal indictments. She blamed me for the environmental protection fines. In her completely fractured reality, she was the innocent victim of a wealthy, vengeful old man, totally ignoring the mountain of fraud, assault, and tax evasion she and Julian had actively committed. I sat on that wooden gallery bench for a long moment, letting her wild, hysterical accusations bounce entirely off my armored composure. A deep, hollow ache settled into the center of my chest. It was the definitive, final grief of a father realizing his child was truly gone. Looking at Chloe now, seeing her face distorted by pure entitlement, I knew the sweet little girl, who used to wait on the porch for my Ford truck to pull into the driveway, was dead. Standing in her place was a complete stranger, entirely consumed by superficial greed and supreme arrogance. She genuinely believed the sole purpose of my existence was to serve as a bottomless, silent bank account, meant only to fund her disastrous mistakes and shield her from the cruel consequences of her own actions. I thought about the decades of exhausting, backbreaking labor I had endured to build my industrial, electrical empire. I remembered working countless double shifts in municipal basements, flooded with toxic waste, just to ensure she never had to experience the devastating poverty I grew up with, ruining my knees and scarring my hands in the process. I gave her the absolute best education, the safest neighborhoods, and a completely debt-free start to her adult life. I poured all my love and energy into building a protective fortress around her, but she willingly unlocked the gates for a manipulative parasite and proudly handed him the keys. When that parasite raised a heavy brass lamp and violently smashed it into my skull, Chloe didn't see a bleeding father. She only saw an inconvenient, stubborn obstacle blocking her path to the master bedroom. The sacred family bond between a father and daughter wasn't severed by my aggressive legal counterattacks or financial operations. It was permanently cut at that exact moment when she watched my blood drip onto the hardwood floor and chose to defend the man who shed it. Martha had begged me to protect our daughter from frauds, even if it meant breaking her heart to do it. I had finally fulfilled that promise. True protection meant allowing the fire of consequences to burn away the rot she had invited into her life. I stood up slowly from the wooden bench, buttoning my custom navy blue suit jacket with deliberate, unhurried precision. I stepped into the central aisle, closing the physical distance between us. I didn't raise my voice to match her echoing screams. I didn't offer a defensive explanation or apologize for the justice system doing its job. I spoke with a low, heavy, and absolutely unyielding authority that instantly forced her to take an involuntary step back. "I didn't ruin your life, Chloe," I stated, my voice cutting through the sterile air of the courtroom like a scalpel. "You and your husband dug a massive, toxic, illegal pit, and I simply stopped throwing my money into it to fill it up." Chloe opened her mouth to scream another vicious insult, but I raised a single scarred hand, instantly silencing her. My calloused fingers stood as a stark symbol of the labor she despised so deeply. When that arrogant fool smashed a piece of solid metal into my face, my blood spilled onto the floor of the house I built with my own hands, I said, my words dripping with absolute freezing clarity. "I was bleeding from my head, and you didn't even blink. You didn't rush over to see if I was seriously injured. You didn't call an ambulance. You looked down at your old father bleeding on the hardwood floor and yelled that I was being selfish. You were entirely content with watching me be physically assaulted, just so you could force your way into my bedroom and save yourselves from your own foreclosure disaster. I took another commanding step forward, my tall frame completely overshadowing her trembling form. My gaze locked onto her panicked, tearful eyes, ensuring she felt the absolute weight of her catastrophic choices. I am not a monster, I continued, delivering the final devastating verdict on our relationship. I am not cold-blooded, and I am not heartless. I simply shut the door that you actively and violently smashed into pieces. You chose your husband. You chose his arrogant fraud and his blatant disrespect. You chose your path, Chloe. Now you have to walk it entirely alone. The absolute freezing finality of my words finally shattered the fragile illusion of defense she had built around herself. The high walls of denial came crashing down. The terrifying realization that she had completely exhausted her ultimate safety net, that there was no hidden trust fund coming to save her, struck her with the devastating force of a freight train. Her legs completely gave out. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed right in the center of the polished marble floor of the courthouse lobby. As she fell, her expensive designer dress crumpled around her, and she let out a devastating, suffocating wail that echoed tragically up toward the high, vaulted ceilings. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a deep, primal panic. There was no wealthy, arrogant husband left to catch her. There was no forgiving, generous father left to write a massive check and make the government agents disappear. She was completely bankrupt, facing her own imminent federal fraud indictments, and plunged into an incredibly catastrophic loneliness. I looked down at her trembling body for a single silent second. I didn't reach out a hand to lift her up. I didn't offer a single word of comfort or a shoulder to cry on. The time for saving her had long since passed. I simply turned my back on her weeping figure, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked toward the exit alongside my attorney. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the federal building and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving Washington sunshine, walking toward my waiting vehicle without looking back. Seattle's brief, gloomy summer gave way to a cold, biting autumn, mirroring the absolute cooling of the chaos that used to be my life. The federal justice system operates with a slow, grinding certainty, completely crushing anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. Julian is currently sitting in a small, windowless concrete cell at a federal correctional institution in Oregon. His expensive custom suits have been permanently replaced by stiff, scratchy khaki prison uniforms. He has been officially designated as inmate number 84720, his daily routine consisting of scrubbing cafeteria trays and counting down the remaining 60 months of his mandatory sentence. He lost his firm, his freedom, and his entire fraudulent identity. Chloe barely managed to avoid the exact same fate. To escape a maximum security facility, she cooperated fully with the prosecutors and signed a devastating plea agreement. The deal required her to surrender every single asset tied to her name. The bankruptcy court and the environmental protection authorities systematically stripped her of everything. The waterfront estate in Mercer Island was foreclosed on by the bank. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury vehicle, and her high-limit credit cards were completely wiped away. She was evicted, humiliated, and left entirely destitute. To survive, to pay for her basic living expenses and chip away at a towering mountain of non-dischargeable debt, my daughter was forced into the absolute bottom of the labor market. She found a grueling minimum wage job as a late-night server at a greasy, run-down 24-hour truck stop on the edge of the city's industrial district. The woman who used to sip premium French wine and mock my working-class lifestyle now spends her nights pouring cheap, burnt coffee for exhausted truck drivers and tired college students. She lives in a cheap, unheated studio apartment, relies on public transportation, and barely gets by on the kind of meager wages she spent her entire adult life laughing at. She has no safety net, no wealthy husband, and absolutely no father left to pull her out of the miserable pit she dug for herself. The pure, absolute poetic justice of her current existence is impossible to ignore. Chloe spent her entire life looking down on manual labor. She explicitly chose Julian because of his Italian leather shoes and his sleek briefcase, actively rejecting the honorable, calloused hands that had built the hyper-privileged life she took for granted. To her, getting your hands dirty was the ultimate sign of failure. Now dirt was her permanent reality. During a particularly brutal night shift, a disruptive customer left a catastrophic mess in the truck stop restroom. The demanding, underpaid shift manager didn't bother calling a professional cleaning service. He walked straight up to Chloe, handed her a stained mop and a bucket of cheap industrial bleach, and ordered her to clean the stalls immediately if she wanted to keep her job. The woman who had once ordered me to clear out of my own master bedroom so she could have more closet space was now forced onto her knees on a sticky, cracked linoleum floor. She had to plunge clogged toilets and scrub waste off the porcelain. The flawless acrylic manicures she used to flaunt were completely gone, replaced by cracked, raw, blistered fingertips. The stinging, toxic odor of cheap bleach and rancid fryer. Grease permanently soaked into her clothes and skin. It was the exact same industrial smell I used to bring home after working grueling 14-hour shifts running commercial grid conduits. It was the smell she used to complain about, the smell she claimed embarrassed her in front of her superficial friends. Now it was her permanent perfume. She was experiencing the raw, uncompromising reality of the working class, but without any of the honor, union backing, or hidden wealth I had possessed. She was completely broken, physically exhausted, and mentally drained. Every time she scrubbed that filthy floor, or wiped down a sticky diner table, she had to endure the agonizing knowledge that she had actively chosen this exact fate. She had willingly traded in an ironclad fortress of generational wealth for a cheap, crumbling illusion of corporate status. She played a reckless game of greed, lost everything, and was left with nothing but a mop and the ultimate weight of regret. While Chloe spent her nights scrubbing industrial grime for pennies, I spent my days making aggressive, highly strategic moves. The bank that had seized Julian and Chloe's downtown penthouse finally put the distressed property up for public auction. The massive, sprawling estate was deeply underwater, burdened by multiple secondary liens, and its market reputation was heavily damaged by Julian's high-profile federal fraud conviction. Most legitimate buyers stayed far away, wanting nothing to do with an asset tied so closely to a criminal enterprise. I didn't attend the foreclosure auction in person. I sat comfortably on the cedar deck of my lakeside estate, while Victor Vance attended the proceedings downtown as the authorized legal representative for a highly private, anonymous private equity firm. That specific equity firm was entirely funded and controlled by my primary blind trust. Victor executed the bidding with precise, surgical strategy. Because the property was so heavily distressed and market interest was practically non-existent, my trust fund bought the multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse at a rock-bottom minimum bid, a mere fraction of its original market value. I bought the crown jewel of Julian's arrogant ego for pennies on the dollar. I didn't buy the penthouse to live in it, and I certainly didn't do it to preserve their memory. The very next day, I deployed my top commercial contracting crew to the site. I ordered them to violently tear out the custom Italian marble, rip down the ridiculous modern art fixtures, and completely gut the interior. We aggressively converted the space into high-end, fully functional commercial rental offices. I turned the symbol of their fake, empty superiority into a highly profitable, top-performing commercial asset. Every single month, a massive rental check generated from their former home is deposited directly into a high-yield community account. I took the physical manifestation of their extreme greed and repurposed it to generate honest, clean income, and they will never even know I was the man pulling the strings behind the corporate curtain. Back at the rundown truck stop, the early morning sun was just beginning to cut through the grease-stained windows. Chloe dragged the heavy mop bucket out of the restroom, wiping a thick layer of toxic sweat from her forehead. Her back ached violently, and her feet were swollen from standing for 9 consecutive hours. She leaned heavily against the laminate counter to catch her breath, casually looking up at a small, static-filled television mounted above the pie display case. The local morning news broadcast was airing a breaking segment on financial philanthropy. The anchor was enthusiastically detailing an unprecedented, massive local donation. A high-definition, full-screen photograph flashed on the screen. It was me, Arthur Crawford, wearing a tailored navy blue suit, standing proudly in front of a newly established community vocational training center. The bold headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, Mysterious Industrial Electrical Tycoon, Arthur Crawford, steps into public spotlight, pledging $5 million cash to support victims of domestic financial abuse. Chloe stared at the screen, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The heavy serving tray slipped directly from her raw, blistered hands, crashing loudly onto the dirty floor. The morning sun poured through the massive ballistic glass windows of my lakeside home, casting long, warm shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I sat quietly in my spacious dining room, my calloused fingers gently tracing the smooth, finished wood of the chair beneath me. This was the exact solid oak chair that had been shattered during the confrontation in my old home, the furniture broken as I defended myself. After the police carried Julian away in handcuffs, I gathered every single broken piece from the floor. I didn't throw them away. Instead, I took the shattered wood to a master craftsman, a man who respected the history of hard work just like I did. He painstakingly rebuilt the chair, carefully bonding the fractured wood with industrial epoxy and coating it with a thick protective finish. The chair was whole again, but the deep, jagged scars from the impact remained clearly visible across the backrest. I traced the raised grain of the restored wood, then slowly brought my hand to my own face. My fingers brushed against the thick raised scar resting on my cheekbone. When Julian struck me, he was trying to leave a mark of submission. He wanted me to look in the mirror every day and remember that I was a weak, powerless old man who had been violently conquered in his own home. He failed completely. This scar isn't a mark of victimhood. It is my highest medal of honor. It is the undeniable physical proof of my absolute liberation. The dull ache that occasionally flares up in the cold weather doesn't remind me of trauma. It reminds me of the exact moment I finally woke up. The moment I stopped being a silent provider and became an unstoppable force of nature. For 40 long, grueling years, the entire meaning of my existence was defined by relentless sacrifice. I woke up at 4 in the morning every day, pulled on heavy steel-toed boots, and walked out into the freezing dark. I spent my youth on industrial sites filled with dangerous electrical arcs and toxic insulation fumes, ruining my knees to build a commercial contracting empire. I did it all without a single word of complaint. I endured the physical pain because I wanted to provide a flawless, impenetrable shield of financial security for my family. I wanted to be absolutely certain that my daughter would never have to experience the biting poverty I faced as a child. I wanted her to have the elite private schools, the perfect dental care, and the beautiful clothes I could never afford when I was young. But in my blind commitment to providing that perfect life, I made a fatal mistake. I protected Chloe from the harsh realities of the world so completely that she lost the basic ability to respect the hands that built her sanctuary. She mistook my quiet, humble nature for weakness. She looked at my faded flannel shirts and assumed I was foolish. She married an arrogant, abusive parasite because he wore shiny suits and spoke with aggressive corporate authority, completely forgetting that real authority is forged in the fires of honest, hard labor. Sitting here, in the absolute primal silence of this heavily fortified estate, miles away from the noise and greed of the city, I finally understand the true depth of Martha's final wish. 当美丽的妻子求我保护克洛伊时, she wasn't asking me to write blank checks to cover up her mistakes. She was asking me to save our daughter's soul. And the only way to save a soul that has been completely rotted by greed is to strip away every single material possession they worship. I had to become the villain in her story so she could finally face the consequences of her own reality. I had to protect myself to truly defend the legacy of the family Martha and I built together. People in my social circles, the few trusted friends who actually know the full story of this entire saga, often ask if I feel a lingering sense of guilt. They ask how a father can sleep peacefully at night, knowing his only child is scrubbing biological waste off the floor of a rundown 24-hour truck stop just to survive. My answer is always an unwavering, absolute yes. There is a dangerous misconception in our society that family blood demands unconditional, endless forgiveness. People believe that no matter how severely a relative abuses you, betrays you, or attempts to destroy you, you are fundamentally obligated to give them a second chance. I reject that philosophy entirely. In my vocabulary, there is no such thing as cheap forgiveness. When an adult woman actively chooses to stand by, screaming insults at her aging father as he lies bleeding on a hardwood floor, the social contract of family is permanently incinerated. I do not owe Chloe a dramatic, tearful reunion. I will not be secretly mailing envelopes of cash to her dismal studio apartment. Julian is exactly where he belongs, counting the days in a concrete federal prison cell. And Chloe is precisely where she needs to be, learning the brutal, unforgiving value of earning a dollar through honest labor in physical pain. Meanwhile, I have completely consolidated my legacy. Yesterday afternoon, Victor Vance officially finalized the restructuring of my entire financial portfolio. The ironclad blind trusts have been permanently locked. When my time on this earth eventually comes to an end, my staggering 8-figure industrial fortune will not be inherited by a spoiled, privileged heir. The law mandates that every single penny will be distributed to the city's vocational and technical schools, funding full scholarships for hardworking minority students who want to learn how to weld, lay electrical grids, and create honest infrastructure. My life's work will empower the next generation of builders, completely bypassing the greedy hands of those who only know how to consume. My phone vibrated gently against the polished surface of the dining table. The screen lit up, displaying a short, encrypted text message from Victor Vance. The final asset protection transfers are fully complete and legally binding, the message read. Nobody can ever touch a single cent of yours again. Enjoy your morning, Arthur. I didn't reply. I simply locked the screen and placed the device face down on the wood. I reached out and picked up my favorite ceramic mug, feeling the intense, comforting heat radiating through my scarred palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee, letting the bold flavor awaken my senses. I stood up from the restored oak chair, walked across the pristine living room, and stepped through the sliding glass doors out onto the expansive cedar deck. The crisp, clean morning breeze filled my lungs. I walked straight to the heavy wooden railing, looking out over the perfectly flat, glass-like surface of the private lake. The water reflected the deep blue sky above, completely undisturbed and wonderfully silent. I let a deep, peaceful, and utterly unshakable smile spread across my face. Sometimes, to rebuild a house, you have to let the rotten parts burn themselves to ash. Looking back on this entire painful ordeal, the biggest lesson I've learned is that blind generosity can easily become the architect of entitlement and indulgence. We instinctively want to protect our children from the hardships we faced. Yet, when we provide an endless financial safety net, we accidentally strip away their opportunity to develop resilience and basic human decency. Real love doesn't mean funding a toxic lifestyle or accepting blatant disrespect just because you share the same blood. Sometimes the most profound act of love is to completely withdraw your support and let the harsh reality of the world teach the lessons you no longer can. If you agree that dignity and respect should never be sacrificed for toxic family loyalty, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.